Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Itachi was interested in having a child. Petunia performs a bit of accidental magic. It says something about her parenting that Uchiha Itachi is considered a better prospect for raising a child. Young Hari is raised by one of the most infamous nukenin of all time and a cadre of uncles whose cumulative effect is very prominent. And someone had the bright idea to bring him back to England. Merlin helps them all. Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 92, In Their Preventatives. Dumbledore rose from his seat. And that concludes the meal portion of the evening. He smiled at the assembled students, some of whom had yet to receive their food. We will now proceed to the dancing. Champions, you are expected to lead the first dance. He spread his hands and the tables shuffled themselves around, clearing a large square in the middle of the hall to serve as a dance floor. Hari stood and offered Circe his arm. She rested her hand on it with a fluttering of her lashes that he was either ignoring or missing entirely. Beside him, Fleur was working out how to dance with the girl who was more than a foot shorter than her. Krum had already swept Millie up into his arms and made directly for the open area. The first hauntingly chipper strains filled the air as the players got the bagpipes to full blast. In seconds, the hall was filled with the blare of pipes, mixed with the cry of strings and a steady drumbeat. The lead vocalist was singing in something that was probably an early form of Latin and nearly incomprehensible to everyone. Fleur was firmly led by Girl Toby in a simple box step. It was completely out of sync with the song, but was something the two of them could reliably manage despite their height disparity. Victor Krum was whirling Millie around the dance floor, the two of them apparently in their own world where the rhythm fit their frenetic pace. By comparison, Professor Potter and Lady Zabini were more tame, but only because of that. In order to address the height problem, Professor Potter was floating 8 inches off the ground. They were managing to keep to the beat, but their dance was some freakish bastard offspring of a waltz, given that they were dancing to a 2-beat song. There were more than a few wolf whistles when Professor Potter dipped Lady Zabini so far back that her hair was brushing the ground. No one was sure what he said while his face was near her ear, but she flushed and her eyes bugged out slightly for a moment before her face was again playfully seductive, with a hint of confused admiration for the smirking professor who continued the dance without any other sign of the interaction. Several of Hari's friends grabbed the various utensils as they began to move. "Blaze," hissed Hermione, "you can commit suicide when you're not my date." "I'll kill him," snarled the boy. "I don't know what he said to my mother, but it must have been obscene." "Probably," Draco said and quailed slightly under the nearly murderous gazes of the girls at the table. "Just judging from her actions this evening, that's the only thing that'd get a rise out of her." He held his hands up, warding off assault. "Withdrawn. Blaze, if you try and kill Hari, the best that will happen is he won't realize." Daphne was trying a placating tone. "At worst, your mother will be sad because she'll be burying her only child." Blaze subsided, growling in the back of his throat as he did. "I wouldn't." Tracy looked over at Draco, who'd spoken just as she dipped a cup into the bowl of punch. "Why?" "Well, I'm not sure what it's poisoned with, and Professor Potter was really specific about us not imbibing that kind of thing." "Fair enough. I had been planning to test what poisons are in it though." "Never mind then." Draco shrugged. "I've done my duty as your date to keep you from killing yourself while in my care. Carry on. I rather think Professor Potter's lessons got through to everyone. No one's drinking the punch." Tracy watched as Fleur took a deep gulp. "Well, I guess we can watch." Tracy blinked as Fleur looked off in thought, and then pulled a vial from some invisible pocket, emptying its contents into the remaining punch. "Weird. I'd think whatever's in there would be pretty instant in lethality." "Well, she's been modified by Professor Potter, Tracy. I don't think normal rules apply to her anymore." "An apt observation, Mr. Malfoy." The pair shrieked when Professor Snape's voice came from directly behind them. "Pardon me." The tall man slipped around them and dipped a flask into the punch. "I shall look forwards to finding out what sort of messy, horrible death someone felt would be humorous to inflict on my students. It should prove instructive. Why aren't you dead?" Fleur turned around to see the red-haired man in the robe like Harry's. "Come again? Why aren't you dead?" Sasori used the careful pronunciation used with the slow of thinking in foreigners. Her head cocked to the side. "Why would I be dead? You drank the punch." "I did. It needed a bit of nightshade to get the flavors balanced." Sasori's face was blank, but somehow conveyed an impression of confusion. Really, it had a lovely spice to it, but without the bitterness of deadly nightshade, it was just too sweet. "I feel as if this conversation has gotten away from me. At least I feel at home. I want to speak with you about the punch." Sasori turned his head to see Circe scowling at him. "Oh? What's with using a poison that isn't tasteless? It obviously isn't fast-acting enough to get away with that. Against any carbon-based life form, it should have been instantly lethal. Obviously it wasn't. I would instead posit that this," he gestured at Fleur, who appeared amused by the exchange, "is not, in fact, a carbon-based life form. That is simplest explanation." "No," Circe snapped. "The simplest explanation is that you're a talentless amateur." She whirled and sashayed off towards Harry, hips swaying and keeping much of the hall's attention as a result. Sasori blinked slowly. "Once." "Mr. Sasori?" Fleur said carefully. "Harry will probably be upset if you murder his date." "And if his isn't, I will be," said Dumbledore from behind them. "No killing the parents of my students. I don't want to deal with more angst than teenagers have naturally. You can wait until they graduate." He paused. "Though I understand she's getting married soon and her son isn't too attached to the man, so it wouldn't cause me trouble if you killed the husband. Not unless I get paid. Otherwise, I'd be stepping on Harry's toes. Blaze, if you don't stop glaring at Harry at Focus on Dancing, I'm going to make you drink the punch. I'm tired of having my toes crushed." "She's all over him," hissed Blaze. "Yes. And Harry seems to be ignoring it." Hermione sighed as Harry chose that moment to dip Circe again, letting her wrap a leg around his waist to keep from tumbling to the ground. "I'm not kidding, Blaze. Do not step on my toes one more time." Nearby, Pansy was enduring the one dance she was obligated to engage in with her date. He was scrupulously ensuring his hands touched nowhere that might be felt as untoward. Daphne slipped by with her fearful companion struggling to keep up in a dance intended to be led by the man. "Are you suggesting my mother isn't good enough for him?" demanded Blaze. Hermione rolled her eyes. Then Blaze was tumbling off the dance floor, propelled by a blast of force. He managed to bring himself to a halt just before he would have slammed into the wall. Hermione turned on her heel and marched off towards where Madame Pomfrey was sitting. Pansy shoved the boy away from her and scowled. "Fuck this shit." Draco winced. "Oh boy." Tracy froze. "Do we need to run?" "I don't think so." But Pansy's just shoved her way onto the stage. "Oh. What?" "I can't hear you." Draco shouted. Tracy looked at him and saw that he'd shoved a pair of earplugs into his ears. Pansy's got out her music thing. The music ground to a halt as Pansy casually banished the singer out of her way and placed the device on the floor. She pressed a button and the hall began to ring with the sound of gangster rap. Pansy drew her gun. "Get back to dancing, bitches." Fred and Gred looked at each other and shrugged before dragging their dates to the center of the rapidly emptying dance floor and throwing themselves into a series of highly involved dance moves that required putting to use much of Professor Potter's physical education regime. Moments later, they were joined by Girl Toby, who was almost a blur as she displayed energy enough for three. From his seat at the high table, Dumbledore was waving his fingers as though conducting the music, a pair of pink, fluffy earmuffs on his head, and a content smile on his face. Snape had apparently cast some form of personalized silence, because he was sipping from a glass of wine. Around the room, most of the students were hastily conjuring ear protection or casting fields of silence, only to find that the spells they'd learned for such purposes were not effective against whatever it was Harry had done to make the thing. Mad-Eye was glad to see that the focus on conjuration was paying dividends. Students were managing to create rather thorough ear protection. Harry was sitting beside Fleur, who was sipping another glass of the punch. "That is some impressively vulgar language," she commented after listening for a time. "I tried to find something to her parents' tastes. They swear rather often and curse even more." Harry shrugged. "I don't know if they liked it or not. They're always so glad to see me that they use foul words and throw friendly curses at me." Fleur blinked and looked down at the punch for a moment. Then she remembered that this was Harry who was talking, and that reality seemed to be someone else's problem when he was involved. "Are you comfortable?" "Why wouldn't I be?" asked Harry at the same time that Circe raised her head enough to nod and say yes, before returning to her position draped over Harry, head resting on his shoulder. Fleur shrugged. "Your son is a little upset." "Yes, well, he's a silly boy sometimes. I'm glad that he's not only interested in boys though. I mean, Harry's a lovely boy, but I do want grandchildren. Of course, Miss Granger seems to be a little upset with him at the moment. I'm sure he'll cheer her up though." "I did not realize your headmaster was so limber," said Fleur. She was watching as an earmuffed Dumbledore dragged Madame Maxime onto the dance floor and began to lead her into something that resembled the jitterbug, but with more energy. The pair were rapidly clearing the floor around them with flailing limbs. "I wonder though, does anyone plan to actually follow the beat?" So far, the dozen or so dancers were all out of step with both the music and each other, the result being an unsynchronized mass of competing couples, and a trio where Girl Toby had managed to drag Daphne and her date into the chaos. "They do seem to be having fun," Snape said as he sat down at their table. Which is more than can be said for many school events. He closed his eyes as Dumbledore led an attempt to sing the school song louder than the music. "I wish he wouldn't do that. Or, at least, pick a single tune. Does Krum know the words to your school song?" Fleur stared at Victor, who had an arm around Millie's shoulders, and was belting out the words to something. "No idea. But not knowing the lyrics rather embodies the spirit of the Hogwarts song. At least since Dumbledore became headmaster." Circe trailed a finger along Harry's chest, grinning at the furious expression on Snape's face. Snape decided he didn't want to know what caused her to squeak and blush enough to redden her dark skin. It would probably be something he'd have to deal with, and that would kill the mild buzz he'd been building up over the evening. He was a little worried about the intent way that Sasori was staring at Harry's date from a corner. He hoped that the man heeded Dumbledore's orders not to cause his students trauma he had them learning from Professor Potter, and didn't want to know what would happen if they became emotionally disturbed. On the dance floor, Girl Toby was forcing people to join a conga line. Pansy observed the chaos. "This is more like it," she said, pulling a bottle of fire whiskey from somewhere and taking a long pull from the bottle. Flames curled from her lips as she sighed in satisfaction. Draco winced. "That's the last bottle in her case." Lucius Malfoy accepted the letter from his son Zull. The boy wrote less frequently since Professor Potter took up the post of, well, he had a lot of temporary titles, but as far as Lucius was concerned, they all came under the heading of terrifying. On the upside, his son's letters were more interesting and tended to not be a litany of complaints and demands for things. Overall, it was a wash as far as he was concerned, at least as long as the lad kept on the slightly crooked and narrow. Outright criminality was no longer a safe activity in Britain, but a bit of creativity was not, as of yet, lethal. He read the letter. Then he read it again. Then a third time, just to be sure he'd understood the request correctly. It was nice that it was an actual request, rather than an attempt to order him around, but still. He snapped his fingers. "Mimsy, tell Narcissa to get in here." A few minutes later, his wife entered the room. He took a moment to appreciate the view. Without guests expected, she was wearing a dressing gown that would have left things to the imagination if he hadn't had a good 17 years to memorize it. "So, when did your son become a drunk?" Narcissa blinked at the apparently random statement. Then her face turned from beautiful to lovely and cold. "My son. If he's a lush, it's from your side. The hell it is, I don't drink. I only drink socially." She snapped back. Thankfully, they developed a rule early in their marriage that no matter how furious the argument, neither would reach for a wand. Lucius had occasionally had a lamp thrown at his head, but considering his wife's family, he'd accept that over having the two of them throwing dark spells around their house. Setting aside that each of them would regret it if they managed to actually harm the other, it would wreck the place. "But I don't drink at all." Narcissa drew in a breath to start shouting some more and stopped. "Draco's at school. How would you decide he's a drunk from 3,000 miles away? He sent a letter asking for a case of fire whiskey. A case. And he wants another one every other month for the rest of the year. If he hasn't developed a serious drinking habit, then he's planning to open a bar in Hogwarts." "Oh," Narcissa said. "Send it to him." "What?" "Never mind encouraging him. Do you have any idea how much trouble it will be to smuggle a whole case of fire whiskey into the castle from here?" "Not all that much." She shrugged in a way that, while not obviously so, intentionally drew his attention away from arguing and towards agreeing with whatever she was saying. "Let's say I can do it then. Why are we encouraging him to drink that much?" Her smirk would have been frightening to anyone else. He'd always found his wife's plotting and deviousness to be her best mental feature. She knew it too. That was why she was swaying her hips as she stalked across the room and then straddling his lap. "What do you know? It's not for him." As much as he enjoyed the way things were progressing, his hands settling on her waist, he had to ask, "Please tell me he isn't planning to start a bar." "I'm fairly certain that there would be objections." "He isn't." "Love," Lucius sighed as she nuzzled against his throat. "I already asked you what you know." "So you did." "Narcissa. Just tell me so we can get on with making up for the fight." "It's for Parkinson." She bit the side of his neck lightly. "Why would you mention an underage girl while we're doing this?" Lucius demanded, feeling his lust draining away. "Because she's the drunk? Though I hear that it doesn't seem to cause her to actually get drunk." He pushed her back so he could see her face. "I'd thought those were rumors." "Nope. My sources." "You and your mysterious sources," Malfoy grumbled. "You love the mystery," she chided. "Anyway, my sources tell me that she started last summer after HarryPotter rode with her on a motorcycle to that party. The one where the elder Parkinson lost his arm. So agree to send him the case in the morning, and let me get back to what I was doing." Lucius considered for a moment, felt her nibbling at his jaw, and decided that doing as his amazing wife insisted was probably the best course of action. Chapter 93, Gifts Again. Christmas morning dawned bright and early. Harry's friends in Slytherin were surprised to discover no boxes from him at the feet of their beds. Had it been anyone else, there might have been concern that he'd taken ill. Instead, there was just a sense of foreboding which was not reduced by seeing Harry sitting in the common room with a smile on his face. Someone had conjured a Christmas tree which was so laden with tinsel and glowing lights and dangling charms that it was presumed a tree only on the grounds of having a coniferous shape. "Since everyone stayed for the holiday," Harry said, "I decided I would be traditional and put the presents under the tree." The group looked skeptically at the alleged tree. Daphne tentatively bent down and brushed aside a wall of tinsel to find a collection of boxes. A wave of her hand floated the presents to their recipients. "Nothing for me?" Tracy asked. "You're studying," explained Daphne. That means your gift is that you are to study more, said Hermione. She opened the box in her lap and blinked. Harry, is this the Magna Carta? Yes. I'm not going to ask how you got one of this legally. Funny you should. Hush. Hermione pointed at the book, using a suite of charms she'd found to preserve old manuscripts, and then cuddled the text to her chest. I'm going to maintain my assertion that this is a legal acquisition, and not part of the spree of robberies over the summer. Mill drew a set of robes out of the box. These are nice. Enchanted Kevlar. You're working in the summers now, Harry said. If they actually come in handy, let me know so I can step up your training. Millie gulped and nodded. Blaze pulled from his box a set of antique dueling clothes. He looked over the ornate clothing and decided he didn't want to ask where Harry had found a set that was exactly his size. Thanks, he grumbled. He wasn't overseeing his mother float out of the ball the night before, glowing and blushing in equal measure. Tam looked at the selection of cat toys and treats in her box, and slammed the top back onto it with undue haste, turning bright red. Holding the thing in her hands, she fled the room. She's doing that rather often, murmured Daphne. She examined her gift. An all-expenses-paid trip to Crete. She squawked as Hermione elbowed her out of the way to look at the ticket. Damn it, Harry, why couldn't you get me one of these? A beautiful island in the Mediterranean with an ancient magical community. She bared her pointed teeth and growled at her friend while Daphne snatched the ticket back. Pansy came storming into the room, her wand in one hand and sparking alarmingly. Who the fuck messed with my gun? She snarled. Several of the younger students dove for cover while the older ones had wands out and were casting defensive spells over themselves and others instinctively. I improved it, Harry said, while working a small, wooden cube. Lower weight, reduced recoil, enlarged magazine, strengthened frame for hot loads, some charms to add extra spin, and just about anything else I could add without changing the caliber. Oh, and I changed the grips to walnut. Oh. Pansy blinked. The weight is off. I'm going to need to relearn how to move now. And shoot, if the recoil's changed. Let me know if the modifications I made to the barrel work. I experimented with using alternating magnetic fields to add extra speed to compensate for the size of the round. Pansy began to regard her gun with a mixture of interest and dread. Gingerly, she began to go through some of the drills Harry had taught her. Normal gun safety would suggest that doing this in a room full of people was a bad idea, but for one thing, she was trained by Professor Potter. For another, so were the rest of the people in the room, who promptly vacated the vicinity to allow her space. Hermione sighed. Harry. Are you saying you made a railgun? Only if it works. Hermione threw her hands up in the air, and left the room to store her precious new book. Harry put the finishing touches on the cube, frowned, and incinerated the wood with a glance, then he drew out another cube from his pocket and began to engrave it again. So, said Blaze, who was apparently putting off his hatred of Harry for the moment. Does anyone know what Christmas breakfast will look like with near to the whole school in attendance? The Great Hall had been redecorated overnight. Since Professor Potter had been busy putting finishing touches on a present or two, the faculty had been able to work unmolested and without his usual help. There were Christmas trees everywhere, each bedecked with tiny candles, and inhabited by fairies who were flitting about, sprinkling ornamental snow over the area. Several miles of garlands were strung from just about every surface starting at a height of 10 feet above the ground, and with the liberal use of sticking charms, it was a very thorough coverage. As we all know, Christmas is a time for family, announced Dumbledore, dressed in an absurdly large fake belly, and a Santa Claus outfit which included a set of actual reindeer wandering around behind the head table, nibbling at things, and leaving droppings. Since your houses are your family, it makes sense for you to spend it with your houses. Or you could just ignore that and spend time with your friends. I'm going to go enjoy some more of Professor Potter's bountiful supply of whiskey-laced lemon drops. Harry sat, surrounded by his friends, taking a rare moment of quiet enjoyment. Despite having to make constant allowances for their flaws and personality defects, he nevertheless was glad of them in his life. There was something soothing about the general background chatter of the school, of Daphne's soft murmuring as she conferred with others, collecting gossip she thought was exclusively collected in herself, Tracy humming a tune from last night as she discussed lingerie with Millie of all people, even the bickering of Hermione being embarrassed by something Blaise said, it all blended together in a pleasing way. Krum and Fleur had joined them, Krum sitting beside Millie and giving her a thorough kiss. "Thanks, Professor Potter," he said when he came up for air. "Dare I ask what Harry did this time?" Daphne said. She had a wary expression on her face. "He gave me a voucher for one set of tattoos, usable when Millie comes of age." Krum grinned at the girl next to him. "Not that anything can improve on perfection, of course." "Harry, what is this?" Fleur held out a ring. "Because when a woman gets a ring, it normally has a particular meaning. It's a poisoner detection ring." "I'm immune to most poisons and potions," she responded dryly. "Yeah. But that's not what the ring does. It detects poisoners. Try it." Fleur shrugged and drew a vial out of her robes, letting 2 drops of purple liquid fall into her cup, which sizzled furiously, and began to throw out droplets that ate through the table. The rest of Slytherin looked on as she proceeded to knock back the whole thing. "Now what?" she asked as greenish smoke curled from her lips and nostrils. "See how the sapphire is glowing?" "Yeah. That means a new poisoning or potion attempt has been detected. Now will the ring to show you the one responsible." A glowing image of Fleur formed out of wisps of magic, floating above the gem in the ring. Below its feet was her full name, beside it was a detailed breakdown of the date, time, location, and type of poison. Above the figure was a string of numbers. "Apparition coordinates?" Fleur asked. "Yeah." "Wow." "Yeah. I had some time left though. So I added a few more features. Go walk to the entryway, and will it to call up a list of poisonings and pick the one." The group watched as Fleur rose and walked to the giant double doors. She came back quickly a moment or two later. "It tracks the poisoner?" she demanded. "Uh-huh. I think it should work for anywhere on the planet. I'm not sure how many incidents it can record, but I used the same principles as I did for Pansy's gift a couple years ago, and we haven't worked out the cap on that one yet." "Harry." Hermione sighed. "Did I break a rule again?" he asked politely. No, I don't think so. If someone had thought of the things you do, I'm sure there would have been a rule for you to break, but this is new territory." The group turned around at the sound of a clearing throat. Sasori cocked his head. "I trust you are being diligent in attending to my task. The first round concludes at the end of the month." Krum smacked his head with his hand and then leaned over and whispered to Harry, who shrugged and nodded. Krum dragged Millie from the hall. "Professor Headmaster?" called Harry. Dumbledore let out a drunken hiccup and looked around sleepily. "Yesh." "Krum is taking Millie with him to Paris as part of the first of Uncle Sasori's tasks." Dumbledore waved a hand dismissively and proceeded to take a deep pull from a bottle of gin he had acquired. "I'm not sure why he's going to Paris," Harry murmured to Fleur. "Last I heard, our agents are in Chile." The demi-human shrugged. "Was there any leg of the task so far even in Europe?" "I don't think so." "Huh. You have agents?" Daphne hissed. "My father is important in the French government and the international community," was Fleur's explanation. Harry just stared at Daphne until she threw her hands up in the air and stormed out of the hall muttering. "You seriously have agents?" Hermione asked. "Like agents?" Harry turned to Fleur and engaged her in a discussion of exotic poisons and their sources throughout the Muggle world. Professor Potter, Snape's voice was almost amused. I will thank you not to help a certain man of our mutual acquaintance in his attempts to get me to branch out in subjects of study, even if it involves being given some of the rarest, seminal works on the matter. They were basic treatises, so I figured he didn't need them anymore. Snape took a moment to process that statement and then covered his face with his hands and walked back to the head table where Professor MacG was nursing her hangover after drinking rather a lot the night before. She had not been amused to find a collar with a large bell on it waiting for her in the morning, but it hadn't attacked her, so that was something. Alastair Moody was having a wonderful morning, sitting and staring at the gift from Professor Potter, wielding ever more obscure detection charms to ensure that there wasn't anything untoward within. So, the time comes to present the subject of the race. Sasori was seated behind a desk, watching the four champions with a gaze as steady as a statue's. So, who got it in the end? Harry grinned slightly as he pulled a small floppy disk from his pocket and placed it on the table. I gather it was a near thing in the end, he said to Fleur by way of consolation. Just a bit of a scuffle for the prize. I heard, she scowled. I'm not sure if I would call 3 French citizens dead a scuffle. Is it up to 3? Harry asked, his tone conversational. Last I had heard, it was 2 and a critically wounded. Crumb was smiling to himself as he lounged in a chair, observing the discussion with every sign of amusement. Girl Toby approached the desk and dropped a floppy disk on it. It was identical to the one Harry had produced. So, it turns out that the rumors that the Six Tails was in mist was a decoy intended to lure Haydn and Kakuzu. Zetsu was sitting at the table with the newly reduced Akatsuki, reviewing recent news. From what I can gather, both are now dead. Dead? Asked Konan. How can Haydn be dead? Permanently incapacitated then, the black side offered. Kakuzu is definitely dead. Apparently Hatake Kakashi was used as a distraction. An S-class assassin was used as a distraction? Demanded Pain. Chirped the white half of the plant man. Apparently, he was taken out by the head of the Uchiha clan. All eyes turned to Itachi. What? Toby, Pain and Konan sat in a somewhat smaller meeting area. What the hell is going on? Demanded Toby, his voice metallic and cold. I have no idea. But it's getting increasingly hard to run an organization when I lose personnel like this. Chapter 94, Ruined Ruins. And so, we welcome back those of our number who had kindly graced us with their absence for the winter holidays. What little peace that brought is now coming to an end. Dumbledore glared at the students. I am sure you are all eager to get to breakfast, and I am eager to send several people to Egypt. It should be entertaining. The 4 champions gathered in the lounge, waiting for the judges to come. Any ideas on the task? Harry asked. Tombs, said Fleur. Why else send us to Egypt? Crumb shuddered. An unknown length of time in a place with baking sun. Joy. I am made for cold and snow. The judges entered the room, Dumbledore holding 8 lengths of rope. The task is simple, said Madame Maxime. You are all being sent to the Valley of Kings. You have 1 week in which to acquire an object from the tomb you arrive at. Once you have succeeded, or 1 week is over, you will use the second portkey to go to a second tomb. You are to reactivate and restore its traps after placing an object you find suitable in a location to be found by someone who manages to bypass the defenses. Any questions? Percy asked as Dumbledore distributed pairs of ropes to each champion. These will activate in 5 seconds, explained Dumbledore. We only have 2 portkeys here, Crumb said. Does one of them have a second charge to get us home? No, replied Dumbledore, cheerfully. Getting back is part of the task. And I should mention we haven't exactly cleared this with the Egyptian government, magical or otherwise. The portkeys triggered. Dumbledore smiled genially at Alastair when the retired madman took a seat beside him for a late luncheon. Most of the castle were off at classes at the moment, but what with one thing and another, he had to deal with work before food and was now catching up on the lost meal. At 3 days into the task proposed by Madame Maxime, and the Supreme Mugwump had yet to hear a complaint from anyone. It was a remarkably peaceful time. Then things caught up with him. Alaster? Yeah. The Auror was dishing food from a satchel onto a plate. What are you doing here? You have a class to teach right now. No, I don't. I only do that as a substitute. Professor Potter is on an assignment in Egypt, Alaster. Huh. Then who do you suppose is teaching my class of Fursties the finer points of evisceration? Moody watched the rapidly retreating form of the headmaster and shrugged. Albus got himself worked up over the strangest things. Harry didn't look up from his precise work on the screaming man chained to the desk. We'll continue in a moment, I just need to talk to the headmaster. In the meantime, Volans, see if you can locate the spleen. What can I do for you, headmaster? You're supposed to be in Egypt. And? You're in Scotland. I'm commuting to work. I feel as if you're not taking this task seriously. Possibly. No, that's a kidney, there's another one just like it on the other side. Pay attention to those kinds of things. If you'll excuse me, headmaster. Headmaster? The judges were gathered in Dumbledore's office, once again reviewing the options for how to score the whole mess of a task that should have been easy evaluate. I think, Igor, that it's clear that Crumb loses this round. There was no attempt made to extract the first object, let alone an effort to guard the other tomb. Dumbledore spoke with a mild tone and a hint of chiding to his words. The problem seems to be Professor Potter's conduct. The defenses put up are utterly alien and hellishly secure, and your first thought is that a young man devised them? Asked Madame Maxime. Yes. We could always call Harry in here and just ask him, suggested Sasori. That would speed this whole matter up significantly. It probably would. Most of the room yelped and spun to see Professor Potter sitting on a windowsill, his back resting against the thick stone, and a long needle spinning between his fingers, having caught it when his uncle launched it at him to make sure he stayed on his toes. What seems to be the problem? Did you tamper with your competitor's rune work at the second sight? No. Well, began Karkaroff. I fixed it. What do you mean fixed? Demanded Madame Maxime. They'd made some mistakes and forgotten a few things, so I put them in. Harry. Sasori closed his eyes. Times like this, he wished he had enough biological remnants of himself to sigh properly. Was that in the mission parameters? No. Then should you have done it? They had made mistakes. Should you have done it? No. Well, that deals with a second competitor, then, Sasori said with a bit of cheer. It looks like Harry is disqualified for actions outside the explicit instructions of the task. He directed a dark look at his nephew. Perhaps you'll remember in the future that you are to fulfill the assigned task, not what you feel the task should have been. It does my heart good to see a judge who remains impartial enough to criticize his champion. Dumbledore smiled, though there was a slightly razored edge to it as he turned it on his fellow headmasters. So, we're left with how to judge rune work we can't get access and observe. The rules have many contingencies, but not for being unable to even inspect the result of the task. Besides, said Percy, I'm not sure how having to do that for 2 people instead of just the one is much of an improvement. Speaking of which, Professor Potter, were your efforts in an attempt to aid your competition? I guess. Percy pulled a sheaf of notes from his pocket and skimmed them a few times. That solves that, Percy declared brightly. It looks like the remaining 2 champions are disqualified for receiving outside help. That's the whole scoring problem solved, then, said Dumbledore. For the sake of armchair judging, though, Professor Potter, how would you describe the work of your competition prior to your assistance? Fleur's work was pedestrian but shows signs of potential. Pedestrian? Demanded Madame Maxime. Mademoiselle Delacour has won awards for her rune work. The goblins are headhunting her for their curse-breaking and curse-laying divisions straight out of school. That doesn't change the quality of her work, madam, replied Harry. It was passable and might even have worked against anyone who wasn't ready to break into an Egyptian tomb. I'm not sure how to estimate Girl Toby's work though. As best as I can tell without going back in time to examine the tomb as it was, mind you there were only the original defenses active when I got there. The closest way I can think of to describe it is that it looked like someone had just reactivated the tomb's entire array. In light of Uncle Sassery's point, Girl Toby would probably win. Do you need me for anything? Only I left my second-year class practicing with their knives, and I should show them a few tricks before the end of the period. Albus, why on earth did you bring in one of the champions to evaluate the work of other champions? In part because Professor Potter probably never considered lying. To my shame. Sasori muttered. And mostly because he's probably the youngest runes master in recorded history. Certainly, the most accomplished for his age. Dumbledore smiled at the goggling faces and smiled beatifically. Did I forget to mention that? I'd forget my head if it weren't attached. How could we all be disqualified? Demanded Fleur. She sat beside Harry at the Slytherin table. Krum was busily necking with Millie, who had gone missing for 2 weeks. Well, technically Victor wasn't disqualified. He just got a 0. Fine. But why was I disqualified? For receiving outside help. Fleur's expression turned from indignant to outraged. They question my abilities? Her voice was a little harder to understand as fires began to collect around her tongue and in her hands. Not at all. Madame Maxime even defended your work when I mentioned it was pedestrian. Pedestrian? Yes. Nothing to be ashamed of. You've got potential. Potential? Are you just going to repeat everything I say? How was it pedestrian? You had the power runes spaced wrong. It was inefficient and you wasted a good deal of space on your arrays. They weren't bad, but they could use some extra twists to avoid being so like the formulaic ones out of textbooks. In a bunch of places you had managed to get a fairly accurate interpretation of the original defense, but you were forced to patch it. And you have a rather limited collection of runes you draw on. From what I can tell, you favor Egyptian, a bit of Norse, and little else. Fleur's mouth dropped open. She had been expecting a rather more flippant response from Harry. Even sitting in his classes for several months, she knew that he was usually irreverent. To hear him suddenly serious and giving a completely straight evaluation of her abilities was a bit of a shock, possibly more than what could have been considered a scathing review thereof. My uncle did point out that we were only supposed to be reactivating the tomb's defenses, so you can probably be forgiven for the heavy reliance on Egyptian runes, but your vocabulary there is clearly limited if you needed to draw on European runes to fill in gaps. That also excuses the lack of innovation, but the original work was so flawed, even when limited to just Egyptian rune schema, that it was hardly worth reactivating. There's a reason that those defenses were down, after all. Fleur blinked. What? How? I might have gone in and fixed up your work. I didn't add any of my own stuff, but I tightened up the schema, fixed up the patch jobs, and got it looking a little more like it should have. You did what? If I recall, he has his mastery already. Pansy decided to interject so that things didn't get into a circular discussion. He does. I think so. Right, Harry? I guess. I think that it was the gift I made for the headmaster. I don't get why, it wasn't anything special. Just a perpetual candy. It was more a proof of concept than anything. I mean, it works, but still. Perpetual? Yeah. If I remember correctly, it transformed saliva into sweetness and used the conversion to power the whole thing. Fleur shook her head. I should not be surprised by this, but somehow I am. She considered the young man who had returned to his book once it appeared that his friends were content to talk amongst themselves. Teach me. When Harry didn't respond, she poked his shoulder. Harry? Teach me runes. I guess? Like I said, you have potential. Be in the Slytherin common room at 11 every night. You'll want to get Professor Snape to set you up with a room in the Slytherin dorms. Hermione remembered what it was like at the end of a lesson. There is no way you want to drag yourself out of the dungeons at 4 in the morning. Aside from curfew, you'll want to do nothing but go to sleep. 4 in the morning. Fleur couldn't help the incredulous tone. That's an estimate, Hermione admitted. It frequently runs longer. It depends on whether Harry's students make progress. At Fleur's questioning expression, she explained. Harry is teaching wandless magic to a few people at a time. She shrugged. I won't say it doesn't work, but it involves a lot of late nights. Madame Pants stormed over and began delivering a stern, if rather soft, lecture on the need to maintain silence in the library, and how it was completely unacceptable that Mademoiselle Delacour had used both that volume and those words in a place where children studied. Chapter 95, The Task 2. It's not fair, Tracy grumbled at breakfast. She was showing the strain of 7 months without a good night's sleep. She was also glaring at Fleur, who was having a meal with every sign of poise and not a hair out of place. How come she doesn't look like hell? Vila. Daphne's reply was blunt and to the point. She does look like hell, added Victor from his spot beside Millie. The two of them had shown up a day after the task in Egypt had ended, both of them sporting mild tans and speaking poorly accented French. Everyone at the table rolled their eyes. Despite having a full course load and still attending a few classes, Harry was making use of shadow clones to get around the problems of time. He was nearly certain that he could use his would release, but without more information on how it was to be used, he was still guessing. In retrospect, he should have looked that up when he was raiding Leaf's stockpile of forbidden knowledge. He wasn't sure why they had banned the super zombie technique, but he put it down to them being squeamish. The Harry corner had been enlarged, something that everyone privately thought was supposed to be impossible, and there were a pair of projects going along now. 3 if they counted to large tree that had put down roots through the stone floor and pushed its way through the ceiling. No one had felt up to questioning Professor Potter about it, though, and he hadn't said a word. The cauldron on the common room fire bubbled merrily at all hours as Harry tended to it. Several of the larger dungeon areas were completely barred. One of them had plenty of hazard markings around the only known entrance, so Sori preferred not to be interrupted. The rest were simply impossible to access except by magical transportation. Between them, the 2 ninja had taken over most of the space in the dungeons, but since they tended to be unused, it wasn't much of an issue. The dawn of February 24th was one of the coldest on record, which meant that Dumbledore was grinning broadly as he announced that the entire school was to be out around the lake for the morning. Some of the more cynical students were muttering that this was probably his fault, which he did nothing to dissuade by reminding everyone that magic was forbidden in the tournament area so as not to interfere with the spells used by the champions. It didn't help that he'd shown up to breakfast wearing several layers of ski gear and what looked like an entire caribou skin. His cackle when he noted that included conjured items was just the icing on the cake. The champions gathered on the shore of the Black Lake with Percy, who was also dressed rather warmly. You all know what the task is, he said, his breath not merely steaming, but some of it actually turned to ice and clattered to the frozen ground. I don't, chirped girl Toby, steam pouring from around her mask. She was wearing her usual garments and seemed utterly indifferent to the cold. Oh. Percy seemed a little flummoxed and then realized he probably should have expected. You have someone important to you at the bottom of the lake. If you don't rescue them in an hour, they die. Huh. So, who's mine? Percy paused. I believe it's my youngest brother. And Professor Potter's hostage is my little sister. So, I would appreciate it if you please rescue them. What were you talking about, Weasley? Hissed Karkaroff when the young man had returned to the judge bunker, which was a thermal tent around a large fire. Was it necessary to tell them that they die instead of just never coming back? I taught my students to tell the truth, Igor, chided Dumbledore. What? Any hostage still hostage at the end of the hour will be executed. Dumbledore smiled. I felt it would add a sense of urgency. And they're off. Lee Jordan's voice boomed through the megaphone as the 4 champions each enacted their own plans. Victor Crumb is yes, he's taking off his robes. In this weather. I do believe he's just jumped headfirst into the water. Good grief, is he even human? That has to be a miserable experience. I do believe that the lovely Mademoiselle Delacour has created a boat and floated her way out to the middle of the lake. Shame she's not stripping down. Sorry, Professor. I think she's conjured a couple of metallic spheres and has begun to do something that involves sitting still. Speaking of sitting still, Professor Potter has pulled out what I think is a kukri and is inscribing it with runes. Is he going to even try? Lee Jordan paused. Where is girl Toby? Did anyone see her? Does anyone else think this was a poor spectator event? Called Lee Jordan. I mean, we can't really see anything but the end. Why not at least wait in the nice, comparatively warm castle while we waited? He looked at Professor McGonagall, but the woman had a look of anger on her face that made him think she was wondering the same thing. Through gritted teeth, she was growling a series of unkind words about Dumbledore to warm the heart of any dark wizard. Half an hour after the start of the task, Tam Riddle dragged herself to the shore, her eyes narrowed as she stalked over to Harry, her magic flaring around her and leaving a trail of steaming water. Why did you leave me down there? I have every confidence in your abilities, he replied mildly and turned the dagger over to begin working on the other side. Tam's scream of rage echoed around the grounds. Fleur watched the shore. She'd known she wasn't going to win this task. The downside to the increase in her fires was that she was even less comfortable in water, though the cold was barely even noticeable. Instead, she'd focused on taking out some aggression on the merfolk. To that end, she had 2 balls of iron which were slowly going from cherry red to blazing white as their cores were filled with increasingly unstable levels of fire magic. McGonagall's grumbles had died down a bit, but she had browbeat several students into cutting down trees and building her a bonfire, as she was unable to wear winter coats and someone had forgotten to expect Arctic temperatures when crafting her garb, something she was resolved to mention to their creator at the next. She stomped off towards the shore, tail flicking angrily. That looked about right. Fleur let the molten ball of iron fall into the water, where it began to hiss as it left behind a trail of cooling metal. She'd done the math a couple of times and was pretty sure she'd gotten it right, but if she ended up being wrong, it wasn't like anyone important was going to be hurt. She clenched her empty hand. There was a flash of blinding light from the lake and moments later, a geyser of water burst into the air, boiling into steam as it did so. What in the hell did she do? Muttered Tam as she relaxed in a winter coat she'd forced one of the younger students to give her, while she listened to Minnie unleash a verbal tirade at Harry. So far, she felt that the woman had a good point, though it was a bit hard to pay complete attention when it was causing her to breathe deeply. Eventually, it finally clicked what the woman was saying and she rose, tossed the coat from her shoulders around McGonagall's and fled. Fleur pulled a speaking tube from her pocket and shoved it into the water. She knew her accent was horrible, but it would probably do. And besides, after her little demonstration, it shouldn't be hard to understand. Lo and behold, not 5 minutes later, she had a shivering Gabrielle in her boat, huddled around the other ball of molten iron, and was sending the boat scudding along towards the shore. Harry nodded and pulled out a notebook. All right. I think I can do that when I make the conversion. Adding things is easy enough, it's taking things out that's tricky. I assume you'd prefer comfortable temperature to be a constant? At-will temperature control would be better. Maybe able to turn it off. Being warm isn't the same as a nice fire. All right then. Have you picked out a design yet? I already told you the total number of square inches I need. It's up to you how you want them arranged. I have been considering some ideas. The woman flushed slightly. I do not really have any knowledge of the matter. Most magicals do not. Interesting. Tell you what, give me the designs you've thought up, and I'll get a couple of consultants. Consultants? People who care about this sort of thing. Victor Crumb grabbed hold of Millie and began to strike out for the surface. It had been easy enough to get his girlfriend, the merfolk had been distracted by something. He'd had to smack one or two of them a few times, but he'd been prepared for a full-on war. He hadn't expected to win, but it would be nice not to come in last place. And there's Victor Crumb, emerging from the water with Millicent Bulstrode. He's making a good go of coming in third. Lee gave a wolf whistle as he saw that Fleur had taken off her admittedly light cloak and put it around her sister's shoulders. Then there was the explosion. Gabriel looked at his sister's arms with an expression of disgust and contempt. Muzzer will be sad to learn she was right, she declared. Coming to Angland has turned you into a degenerate or. Fleur's shriek of rage was followed by her leaping at Professor Potter, her hands extended into claws and flames licking from her mouth and eyes. You bastard! She snarled as she flew directly through the space he had occupied, caught herself on a taloned hand and turned, coiling her legs and extending them to launch her back the other way as they touched the ground. I've offered to fix it, Harry said calmly. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, turning his body to send what had been a controlled pounce into a dive landing in the lake. That was followed by a sound that was less in keeping with a bird and more like a cat which had just been dunked. When Fleur emerged, her anger had gone from blazing to an inferno, as the white dress she wore was only obscuring her body by virtue of the steam curling around her. She stormed over to Gabrielle, sank her claws into the ball of iron which was still glowing, and then snarled as she used a hammer throw to toss it into the middle of the lake, watching the hissing as it sank below the surface with a certain degree of satisfaction. What is the lovely Della? Lee Jordan broke off as there was a brilliant flash once again, and then a new gush of steam blew upwards as superheated water made contact with cool air. Well then, all that remains is to wait out the last 30 seconds of the task. Has anyone seen Miss Girl Toby? The stadium was treated to a girlish scream when the reply came from right beside him. Right here, Mr. Jordan. Almost a minute later, Dumbledore and the rest of the judges were in the booth next to Lee Jordan, pointing out to Girl Toby that she'd condemned her hostage by not rescuing him. What hostage, Professor Headmaster? Ronald Weasley. Why would I rescue him? I was given to understand you're somewhat fond of your battles. I am, Professor. I meant that he's over there. They whirled, spotting the redhead in question in the crowd beside Neville Longbottom, cheering the end of the chilly task and eagerly looking forwards to classes indoors. Uchiha Sasuke considered the notes in his hand. One was the regular note from Naruto, keeping him up to date on the various forms of hell the acting head of the clan was raising in the name of progress. Reading between the lines, Naruto had begun to hire some of the various missing nin he encountered on the extended travels to act as replacements for the Leaf's military police force. It was hard to tell if the ANBU were glad to have the workload reduced, or worried that the parties enforcing the law internally and handling some amount of security were all wanted criminals on the payroll of a clan that some still distrusted. That made Sasuke smile, at least. It was the little things that amused him. The second note was also from Naruto, but was written in code. Even without encryption, it was almost unreadable. Since Naruto had never been one for poetry or classical literature, the only explanation was that it was an extra layer of obfuscation. Infinite is the help man may yield unto man again. Whoso serveth that morning which steals upon the night, and its darkness melts. Creeps upon him a malady on his heart medicine unreaching. Bodily strength serves the conscious thought yet acts as judge for reason. The hour approaches for Janus to pass a torch for Asclepius has no aid for him. Prepare a lambskin for thyself and sharpen the lupins for a fretted roll. Sasuke shook his head. That was nearly impossible to understand. He wondered how much time Naruto had spent with various scrolls to work out how to make it so oblique that Sasuke wasn't really sure he'd understood the whole thing. He drew his sword and ran a whetstone along its length. Chapter 96, Kalahari. Thank you for this, Mademoiselle Delacour, Draco's voice was somewhat waspish as he stared at their dinner. Having declared that it was Mademoiselle Delacour's generosity which had provided the bounty, Dumbledore had delivered the prize to the Slytherin table. This was why the table was now in splinters, the magically reinforced wood crushed under the weight of the entire giant squid. At least it hasn't started to rot. Daphne didn't sound much more thrilled to be faced with eating a creature possessed of tentacles. It isn't cooked properly, snapped Fleur. True, Harry prodded the giant cephalopod with his chopsticks. I don't think the house elves know how to prepare it anyway. I've kept them to local fish. And they call us barbarians, Malfoy whispered to Tracy. You are. Fleur glared at the squid. Her sister had listened to the offer of lunch and dinner prepared in an English kitchen and promptly fled for home via Flo. What are you doing? The last part was to Harry, who had transfigured a portion of the floor into a long trench which promptly filled with liquid. Oh. 2 more trenches had appeared, the first filled with white powder and the second with white liquid. I'll get the temperature? Sure. Harry tapped the stone trench with clear fluid in it, the stone becoming black and metallic. Fleur shoved a hand into what she was unsurprised to find was oil and conjured some of her annoyance at her sibling, quickly bringing it to a boil. The entire hall watched as Harry severed a tentacle, dredged it, soaked it, dredged it again and finally placed it in the oil where it hissed and spat gobs of scalding oil which students dodged with the results of long practice. Does anyone know how he gets the house elves to do what he wants? Muttered Pansy as Harry levitated the giant, crisp limb from the oil, and set it floating in the air to cool and drain. A few moments later, a squad of the little creatures came trooping into the hall, surrounded the giant squid, and trotted back out, squeaking about ice houses. So that just happened, Snape said to Minerva as Harry began to slice up the meal and dish it out to Slytherin. Thank you for joining us. Dumbledore relaxed in his chair. In the commotion yesterday, I do believe we forgot to actually score the champions. I guess that having to dispose of several hundred corpses belonging to sentient creatures can do that to a body. We've had to dig a new disappointment pit. The scores? Prompted Victor, who was eager to return to his girlfriend and their break between classes. Well, Professor Potter and Miss Girltoby both get zeros, Dumbledore stated. Neither of them actually completed the task. Mademoiselle Delacour, you get a 0 for completely depopulating my lake. Mr. Crumb gets 25 points in the form of 2 10s, a 5, and 2 zeros. I'll leave it to your imagination to guess who voted which way. In the meantime, I believe that Mr. of the Red Sands has another little job for you. Yes, Sasori melted out of the shadows. A competition this time. He sighed as his nephew began to grin. With the stipulation that there be no deaths. The grin vanished. You will get your briefing tomorrow. Tomorrow. The next morning, 3 owls winged their way into the great hall and landed in front of Girltoby, Fleur, and Crumb. Shouldn't you be getting one of these? Crumb asked. I don't see why. Arnold took the note out of the owl's claws, skimmed it, and sighed. At least they had been on break for a week this time. He picked up the phone. Get me Kirkbane. Sirius Black groaned as the fire turkey landed on the headboard of his oversized bed. He didn't want to deal with anything other than getting another hour or 2 of sleep in before digging into the potion stock with the 3 women strewn over his body. Still, that was his godson's bird and the boy had a knack for amusement. As such, he extracted one hand from where it had been comfortably lodged and took the scrap of paper. A minute later, he was down the hall, hammering on Remus's door. The werewolf growled something rude before greeting the grinning bastard whom he promptly socked in the face. From behind him, there was a soft sound of complaint as his companion noticed that her bed warmer was not, in fact, warming the chilly air nearby. Despite Sirius's attempts, he had been unable to get Remus to go for the orgy life, which was probably for the best, since the werewolf was in charge of doing anything that resembled real work and just told Sirius which way to vote. If this isn't good, I'm going to get you the way I should have when you decided that coitus interruptus was a hilarious way of finishing my first sexual encounter. It is, I swear. Well, I do believe that I have someone behind me who would rather that I spend my time before breakfast in pursuits other than standing here naked. The upside to having lived with the Marauders for 7 years was that one became rather stripped of self-consciousness by being stripped of everything else far too often. I'm being called in as a consultant. Dear Merlin. Who would hire you to consult anything? The only skill you have is, did you get hired by a magazine on prostitution? Sirius grinned. Better than that. Oh boy. Remus looked over his shoulder. Just a moment, love. We don't need the red cape. He turned back. What is it? I'm being asked to help tattoo MCGGS. What are you two doing? Tam's question came from directly behind Tracy's shoulder. The girl yelped and threw some paper over what she had been working on. Beside her, Millie slammed her own book shut and glowered in a way that would have been scarier to someone who wasn't Tam Riddle. This is the 3rd week now that when you two finish your homework, you join heads and take a corner of the common room. Harry can get away with that. She glanced at the enlarged Potter corner with its large tree and walls covered in seemingly random scribble. But others like corner seats. You should get them sooner, Tracy replied primly. Then she shrieked when both herself and Millie, along with their papers, were flung bodily out of the corner by invisible force. Their training meant that they turned the falls into landings that had them in combat readiness, but Tam was already seated in her favorite armchair with a shimmering barrier of green energy around her, and a book in her hands. Harry. Fleur's voice was flat. Care to explain this? She threw a piece of parchment at him. It appears to be something written in French. Harry frowned. Are you suffering from a loss of reading abilities? I didn't think that was a possible side effect, but... No. Her apparently fragile hold on her temper was lost. This is a letter detailing a number of persons who are currently imprisoned for various charges across the planet. He blinked. Okay? Harry turned back to Tam. I'm serious. I have a project that could use your insight. I have an expert on the matter already, but you've got a bit of specialization in the matter. Are you sure? Fleur slammed a hand on the Slytherin table, newly replacing the giant squid, which was still on the menu a week later. Calamari had become a staple of the Slytherin diet by virtue of necessity, scorching the woodwork. They are people who work for me. Assigned to the task. Harry looked over the list in his Sharingan's memory, and then faced the demi-human. So. You had my agents arrested. Arnold glanced over the report in his hand and began to snicker. Sometimes he loved this job. I don't think I did. Harry's expression was thoughtful. No. I don't remember doing anything like that. He nodded with finality. Not me. So, Tam, are you at least willing to hear me out on what the project is? And yet, Fleur bit out. Somehow every single one of them is in a prison. In countries without friendly ties to France. Harry blanched. Arnold read the letter in his hand and proceeded to hit his head on his papers several times. Then he picked up the phone and cursed soundly, and with variety up until the call was answered. Non-lethal means that they shouldn't be facing execution either. He snarled before slamming down the receiver. Does this mean that there are more than 3 tasks? Yep. Harry shrugged. I'm guessing that there'll be 4 more. We already had one in Egypt and then this is the second assignment from my uncle. What does he have you doing? Treasure hunt. Is it hard? Not really. Just long. Could be worse, Blaise said as he poured himself some tea. He could have told you to rob Gringotts. It's never been done. Harry perked up. Never been done? He glanced over at his uncle, then trotted to the head table for a short conversation followed by the pair exiting the great hall. Tracy recalled a line that seemed most appropriate at this moment. I see nothing. I was not here. I did not even get up this morning. She looked around. Which explains why Draco isn't at lunch. Everyone was relieved to see Harry at dinner. He was beaming in a way that made them uncomfortable, but he'd been teaching classes all afternoon. Dear Lord, muttered Hermione as she stared at the headline of the Daily Prophet. At least we know where Harry was yesterday. I hope, muttered Daphne. What are you talking about? Asked Tracy innocently. Assault on Gringotts led the page above a picture of a partially demolished pile of rubble that had once been the front of the bank. A dozen dead goblins lay strewn about, and a number of black lines suggested that there were several more who had not managed to escape the episode in one piece. Below that was a stirring, detailed account of events narrated by someone present, which was concocted from interviews by the writer. According to what was declared to be the certain knowledge of the eyewitness penning the story, an unknown person had approached the bank in the middle of the day dressed in a heavy cloak and hunched over. Nothing that was too odd in the magical world, although it was unusual for such a creature to move about in Diagon, especially during the day. Sometime later, there were screams from inside the bank and the sounds of battle, and the gthad-drnp, the war cry of the goblins, which no wizard who had heard it remembered fondly, as it was associated with periods of what could be nicely called political upheaval in the magical world. The dark figure had come bursting out of the bank, throwing something behind it which had exploded, sending the roof and front of the bank collapsing inwards. The Aurors had arrived just in time to end up in the second wave of explosions, which had killed or crippled almost half of the veteran Aurors who arrived and severely injured all of the trainees and probationary ones. Harry grinned. I think he got stalled by the carts. It says here that the goblins haven't been able to account for all their people yet, Hermione murmured. There were consolation prizes. Sasori's flat voice drew their attention to the youthful redhead who had wandered over, accompanied by a small, hunched figure wearing a familiar cloak and bearing a rather plain, but well-made spear on its back. Harry was mumbling to himself and scribbling in a notebook. That reminds me, is anyone interested in some improved goblin artifacts? Chapter 97, We're Back. Arnold looked up to see the boss sitting in the client chair. I'm glad you could make it. We just got a big job, but it's not the kind of thing I can give to most of our agents. In fact, the only team I could assign this to are busy on your personal job, so I need you to handle it. Cool. We've been hired to deliver the head of the person who robbed Gringotts. Wow. Harry was nearly bouncing in excitement. Someone else broke into Gringotts? Arnold stared at his employer for several moments, and then put his head in his hands and sighed. Do we have any leads? Yeah, boss. You. From the depths of his hands, Arnold continued, go take a nap or something, boss. Let me give this some thought. When Harry returned from wandering around London, relieving passers-by of their valuables to kill time, Arnold looked a lot more cheerful. It took some work, but I think I have a solution. The smile on Arnold's face was a bit brittle, but it was there. I do believe the goblins may have made a mistake in the contract. So here's what we're going to do. Ragnarok blinked when the Dawn operative walked into his throne room. Considering no one was supposed to know where it was and there were lots of guards and traps to ensure that if someone did learn about the location, they couldn't do anything with it, there was something disconcerting about the young man strolling through the door. Hi. You contracted us to deliver the head of the one who broke into Gringotts, yes? Yes, while it was always nice to have prompt service, it wasn't supposed to be a surprise. Well, here it is. The young man grinned. Where? Right here, the operative tossed a rotting head to the ground. It did not look recently dead. In fact, it was less head and more skull. A bit of pallid flesh still clung to it in a few places, and strands of greasy hair trailed to the floor. The back of it was a ruin that oozed blackish sludge to the marble floor, where it hissed quietly. Now I have to get back to work. The operative walked back out the door, waving cheerily at the guards who were rushing down the hall as the alarms triggered. Arnold looked up to see the boss sitting across from him holding a sack. "Did it work?" "Yep. I got you something while I was out." "Oh?" A bad feeling began to steal over the director pro tem. "Yeah." Harry placed an ornate, golden claw holding a glass ball on Arnold's desk. "I found a goblin scrying crystal. I thought it could be useful." Arnold closed his eyes and whimpered. Tracy absently dodged a swat from a floating wooden hand. It had somehow detected her lapse in concentration and taken the opportunity to alert her to the same. It was difficult to focus though, with the conversation going on in the opposite corner of the common room. "Please don't charge that rune set, I don't want to flee chlorine gas again." "He's going to make what?" "And what do you mean again?" "But I fixed it." "See, this inversion fixed the charge." "Still. I have bad memories of protecting first ties." "Well, if we're not going to review past projects, let's look at this. I have here a rough reconstruction of your power scheme before I fixed it." "What's wrong with it?" Look at all the wasted space." "Where?" "Right there." Harry pointed to a spot that appeared to be in use. "Ari, that's a rune." "Yeah." "Why didn't you layer it?" "Because layered runes are normally postgraduate studies." "Why?" "This is just inefficient. Look, if you give this rune a quarter turn," Harry flicked a finger, and ink on parchment began to move like a living thing. "They flow together just fine." "Why do that though?" Fleur refused to sound impressed. She didn't need to give him an even greater ego. Besides, it wasn't really remarkable, given his abilities. Saves space. And power, come to think of it. See how I overcharge this rune so that it glows yellow? Now it's ready to be linked to the reservoir. "Why are you over there?" "Because that's about to explode." "No, it's not." "Watch. There. Now the whole scheme is powered off one charge. Of course, if I don't do something to close the system, it won't self-sustain, but the Egyptians were good at that. Sometimes it's okay to just crib from the textbooks. That addition you're making isn't in textbooks." "Of course it is. You read Grecian tablets, right?" "No." "None." "Well, there are some good reproductions of fragments found in Alexandria. A few of the locals had done extensive tomb robbing and made notes. It's not a good idea to use the whole array that the tombs had, obviously. I mean, look at how many of them got robbed. I think it's safe enough. Nothing's exploded. This time. This time?" And on it went. "Thank you, Harry." Harry looked up from the essays he was grading. He could read them all at once, true, but since he couldn't write on them all at once easily, it was a somewhat longer task than he might have wanted. He was against essays, personally, but Professor Headmaster had explained that it was an important part of the curriculum. Harry had compromised by requiring all students fourth year and up to turn in essays written with the humors of a designated target. Many of the students who were headed for honors had thoughtfully included diagrams for the proposed battles, and a few had even taken a stab at some of the calculations, leaving diagrams to show angles and arcs. It did the heart good to see students excel. "You finally had my agents released." "I did?" "Yes. Too late to have a chance at the task, but it's something." "Oh. You're welcome." Harry cocked his head. "I wonder what took so long." "I realize that the words have an obvious meaning," Kirkbane snarled Arnold into the receiver. "But I'm choosing to assume that you are using some obscure and possibly original alternate version, which does not mean that I should look into a way to reach through the phone and strangle you with your own entrails." "No. Sod that." Arnold slammed the phone down and glared at the paperwork on his desk. At least he could get that finished. There was a general shuddering when the thing flew in the window at breakfast. All the owls were giving it a wide berth, many of them slamming into walls in their haste to avoid contact. Several mid-air battles broke out as talons were used to settle who had to be closer. It landed in front of Professor Potter and leaned back. Some of its substance turned into a wispy head. "Sorry, boss." It was gone when they got there. Harry's head snapped around to stare at the head table, where Girl Toby was handing Sasori a small package. "HN. Did you ever get around to suggesting placement?" Tam jumped when Harry's voice came beside her ear. "No." "Well, I've heard from my consultant. I expect you to have it ready for class today." "You're making it homework?" "If necessary." Arnold looked up when the boss flamed into the office, looking somewhat harassed. "Something I can help with, boss?" "Maybe. Did we have anything across the pond 2 days ago?" Arnold blanched. "What?" "No." He shook his head. "We don't take those kinds of jobs, boss. There are some limits. In fact, we had no one anywhere in the States at all for the last week. Saccharissa had a bad feeling, so I pulled everyone not on permanent assignment. The closest agent was in Iowa." He paused. "Why would you even need to ask?" "Because Hermione was accusing me. I knew I didn't do it, but I wanted to check before telling her I had nothing to do with it in general." "Definitely not. We don't cause everything that makes it onto the front page. We've got too many clients who don't want that kind of attention. I only just started returning our agents since I got the all clear. I'm just glad I had them out for a week or two. If everyone left April 18th, that would have thrown up all sorts of flags to the locals. I'll tell her I definitely had nothing to do with it." "Thanks." "No problem, boss." Fleur stormed into the great hall and over to Harry, who was engrossed in a pile of letters. For the first time in months, she was wearing short sleeves and her arms bore no tattoos. "You did it again." "Again?" "While I was asleep, you did something." "I inked the concealing scheme." Harry shrugged. "Without permission." "Again." "You were taking too long." Dumbledore looked out his window at the grounds. Below, the second years were trotting into the Forbidden Forest on what had been marked in the schedule as a practice exam. "Mr. Weasley, can I assume that preparations have not been made?" "No, Headmaster." Percy was surrounded by parchment and dusty tomes. "I'm fairly certain that we're covered, though." "That will hardly do." "I meant us personally, Headmaster." "That's different." "Carry on." There was an explosion from somewhere in the dungeons. It was another day at Hogwarts. The 4 competitors were arranged on the lawn near the Black Lake. Each had been handed what was only a broom because it had a thick part with straw tied to one end. Not a one of the 4 was straight, and the one girl Toby held was actually bent into a circle at the far end. In fact, if they had not come out of the broom shed, it could have been forgiven if they had been thought to be some sort of modern art. "You have been handed your itinerary," Dumbledore was saying. "You are to get pictures of yourself at each of the designated locations. This is a race. Go." Victor grabbed Fleur by the hair and flung her into the lake before taking off on a broom and flying directly into the castle. While Fleur screeched bloody murder and began to generate a cloud of steam, Harry calmly kicked off and started flying in the general direction of London instead of the coast of Norway and the first checkpoint. Girl Toby tossed the broom aside and strolled back indoors, unruffled by Crumb zooming out inches above her head with Millie clinging to him for dear life as he flew on a firebolt in a southeasterly direction with all due haste. The judges watched with varying degrees of amusement as Fleur got to shore, examined the 2 brooms available, selected one, and took off almost directly east at a speed greater than the broom could normally achieve as she heated the air around her. "I do hope they're careful," Dumbledore said. Madame Maxime's expression turned suspicious. "Why?" "What with all the not doing anything I've been doing, I seem to have failed to get permission for this event from the governments, actually. I don't think it was cleared with anyone." "Oh well." The worst that happens is that one of your students spends some time in prison. Our students? Demanded Karkaroff. Well, Miss Girl Toby just went back inside, and I think Professor Potter is as likely to serve any prison sentence he is issued as he is to appear for detentions. Well, the worst that happens is that there is an international incident not on my grounds, and so not my problem. Professor? Percy said carefully. I've been meaning to ask about that. Aren't you the top man at the ICW? Yes. So, if there's an international incident involving magic, that would be something you have to deal with, right? Dumbledore stared off into space for so long that they began to wonder if he had slipped into an open-eyed coma. Then he began to swear so explosively that the Black Lake began to develop splotches of red. Hello, boss. Arnold didn't pause as he typed away, writing another memo. It was amazing just how much paperwork one generated running a mercenary organization. But someone had to keep track of supplies and set policy for unexpected criminal charges. Anything special we need done on any of the Eurasian landmass? Not much. But if you'll give me a minute. Arnold turned in his chair, grabbed a large binder and thumbed through it carefully, pulling a couple of pages and then scribbling down the relevant portions on a piece of paper. 2 assassinations, 1 natural causes, and an art theft from a secure goblin vault somewhere in Siberia. I've left off the one from a Ms. Zabini. Bye, boss. Arnold went back to typing. The nice thing about memos was that it was more time he could spend not wondering about that new figurine Kedward had given him. 2 days later, Girl Toby approached the head table at breakfast time and placed a collection of Polaroids in front of Igor Karkaroff. The man stared at them for some time and then rose and stormed from the room, turning ever darker shades of red. Dumbledore picked them up and thumbed through the collection. There was Girl Toby in front of each of the landmarks, frozen midwave, and standing behind someone who was clearly the subject of the picture. He calmly stacked the lot up, squared them off, and set them on fire. The last thing he needed around his office was more evidence that he might have a student even stranger than Professor Potter. They were going to award the girl her points and pretend this never happened. A week after that, the Great Hall was turned into a conflagration. At one time, this would have been normal, when Gryff and Helga were having one of their multi-day rows about something. In more recent years, it had become uncommon to have truly widespread destruction outside the potions classroom. Of course, in the most recent years, while there hadn't been devastation, Professor Potter had encouraged the learning of fire-suppressing spells. The result was that the Rune ward went up in front of the high table, while the various houses flipped their own tables over and used them as improvised barriers, tucking away younger students and putting up shields. The reason for this was the French demi-human standing in the middle of the hall. It had been several minutes since she had ceased her long tirade of French invectives, and had moved on to primal screaming in the center of a whirling tower of fire that sucked the air from the castle into it. She didn't stop until the flames had snuffed the oxygen from around her long enough that she passed out around the same time that the fire ceased. In turn, the reason for Fleur's literally incandescent fury was that she had been informed that despite breaking several records and nearly dying repeatedly to shave precious seconds off her time, she had come in second by a week. The last straw had been when Percy had commented that in the background of more than one of her photos, Girl Toby could be seen, jumping into another picture going on. Or, in one case, behind Fleur. Given the circumstances, it was generally agreed that the response had been rather mild. Jiraiya scowled up at the clouds. Sure, it was called rain, but that didn't have to be literal. It wasn't like Fire Country was on fire. Or even all that hot. The ever-present rain had been unpleasant at first, but the steady, unwavering patter was working a sort of cruel torment on his nerves. It didn't feel right. He couldn't leave though. Somewhere in here was a threat to Leaf and his godson, and those both had to be dealt with. There was something wrong with this place. The people weren't hiding the way they would from a tyrant, but they had no real life to them either. They plodded through the streets of their little towns, going about their business and trying to scrounge what food they could from the waterlogged ground. No one had commented on his presence, or even paid him any mind. Worse though, were the houses of entertainment. Taverns and inns didn't have laughter and cheer filling them. There was just table after table of unsmiling patrons, all absorbed in quiet drinking. No one chatted or played cards or even called for another round. Maids went from table to table, refilling glasses and collecting the coins owed. The brothels were an abomination. No one was happy there. Not even the whores. They didn't even pretend. It was just rooms filled with blank-faced women mechanically going through the motions. The whole place was already dead. Hello, Jiraiya. He'd turned, not expecting to encounter someone who used his name as an insult. Behind him was a very lovely young woman. Despite the cloak, he could tell her body was nicely formed and the blue hair with the flow. Konan? He'd blinked. It was one thing to hear the name and make the connection, and another to be confronted with the evidence. We couldn't believe it's you. After all these years, you finally come back to reign. We? His question had been answered when Yahiko stepped out from behind a shack. The boy had taken up piercing. He also had gained a hard, angry expression. Then another orange-haired man had stepped up next to Yahiko. And another. And another. 5 men had joined Yahiko. The thing that had been bothering him finally triggered. Yahiko, why do you have the Rinnegan? Yahiko is dead. The answer had come from 6 mouths at once. All 6 were beneath pairs of Rinnegan eyes. He died after you abandoned us. All that's left is pain. Long-trained senses had Jiraiya dodging as a blast of force blew the cobblestones apart, sending shrapnel into the buildings nearby. A leap backwards got him out of the immediate danger, but that was enough to put him into the sights of one of the men who had begun to launch actual missiles at him. One had rushed in towards him as the others moved. 3 had stayed together, the squat one in front of the one with the broad nose and Yahiko. The one who looked feminine had conjured a freakish bird and launched into the air. Jiraiya had been hard-pressed to fend off the one in melee, and avoid the barrage of ranged attacks at the same time. Then he'd known to dodge in time again, and the building he'd been fighting on exploded. Something had hooked behind his navel and yanked him towards Yahiko. He tried to take advantage, summoning a Rasengan and planning to smash it into one of the men. The squad one had gotten in the way, and the whole sphere had vanished into his hand. Still, it had been enough to let him disengage again. Yahiko had pursued, black rods extending from his hands to strike at him. A drop or two of blood had seen to summoning Ma and Pa. He hadn't needed to use Sage Mode in a very long time. It clearly surprised the 6 men. Their sharing vision, Ma had observed as he used the melee fighter to block Yahiko's rods, watching in satisfaction as they pierced vital organs. Then he'd been backflipping away to escape another blast and forced to expend chakra to adjust trajectory midair, so that he could avoid the barrage of missiles. He'd nearly died when the melee fighter leapt into the fray a minute later, trying to grapple him, and getting used as a shield against ranged attacks for its trouble. It was definitely dead. That hadn't stopped it from trying to pin him down again, while he tried to close with the ranged fighter. "It's the one at the back," Ma had shouted. Yahiko's calm anger had turned into shock when Jiraiya had put on a burst of speed and nearly reached the target Ma had pointed out. Only the diving intercept by the bird had saved the man, and the one on the bird's back had been turned into paste by the Rasengan. Viscera had flown everywhere, and for a moment, he'd felt more alive than he had in years. Ninja lived by the sword. He'd gone on the offensive, dodging around the melee fighter again and putting a fist into Yahiko's face. It had hurt to do, but it needed doing. The bones had crunched under his hand as the surprised expression melted into a broken mass of injuries. The black rod from Yahiko's chest had been a shock that cost him the use of his left arm. He should have retreated, but there was no way he could leave things like this. It had been eerie, the fight was virtually without any speech. Normally ninja of a certain caliber would have at least a bit of conversation. Here, they had been focuses solely on killing. The rod in his shoulder had gone into the melee fighter's eye and out the back of his head before pasting it with a rasengan to the chest. He'd been forced to dodge Yahiko's fist and the extending rod. It was hard not to be slightly annoyed that his student had apparently expected a trick to work a second time. The sudden tug dragging him onto the rod meant that it did. A tear ran down Jiraiya's face. He'd never get to see Naruto rise to power or try to turn Minato's grandchildren into raging perverts. Or bed Tsunade. And the end had come at the hands of a boy he'd thought of as a son. Why he coughed and blood spilled over his lips as he stared up at the rain. Traitor. He forced himself to concentrate, it was so easy to drift into quiet. You betrayed everything I taught you, boy. You murdered Nagato for his eyes and became a monster. You're no better than Hans Dash. Konan. For Jiraiya, the world became a conflagration. Chapter 98, Queen, circa 1980. You might be wondering why it is that you've been called here on a fine Easter Sunday. I'm guessing it has to do with a task, Crumb said dryly. I could be spending time with my girlfriend, you know. Yes. Percy kept his reply short. Specifically, you are being tasked with the collection of a dangerous magical beast. Your score will be tallied based on rarity of the creature, the level of danger it poses in capture, and how many laws you violated bringing it into the country. And also adjusted by biased judging, Dumbledore put in. I'm posing that instead of having Igor present, we just award 10 points to Mr. Crumb. Bah. Seconded, said Madame Maxime. All in favor? I. Nay, you bastard. Motion carried, you're dismissed, Igor. How long do we have? Fleur asked. 1 month. As usual, you are excused from classes for the duration. Except for Professor Potter, who I expect will commute. Yep. Yahoo girl Toby took off on foot across the lawn for the gates. I'm not sure I want to know what she's going to bring. Pears again? Millie asked as they landed. Not that I'm complaining, mind you. Just surprised. You had me pack a bathing suit. We're only here for the night, Victor replied as he helped her down from the broom and began to lead her towards the bistro they'd enjoyed on their last visit. Then we head to Nice for a week. We're going to be spending most of the time on Sardinia. Oh. Millie smiled at her boyfriend. That sounds nice. On our way back to Hogwarts, we'll stop in and visit your parents. Are you sure you really want me to hit your mother with a beater's bat? Yes. Professor Dumbledore? Percy edged into the headmaster's office and stood, shifting from foot to foot. You remember how we were worried about international incidents? Dumbledore's skull could have scored stone. Yes. Well, Spit it out, boy. There has been an event in, well, I'm not exactly sure where it is, because the location is secret, but Charlie sent me a howler ahead of the official report. Dumbledore closed his eyes. Apparently a very attractive woman flew into the preserve on a broom, blasted the largest female with fire, until it rolled over, and then put a giant collar on it and flew away with it in tow. I see. Sir? What else? We didn't exactly make preparations for live captures. Bugger. Professor Dumbledore? What now? You remember how there was the incident in the Dragon Preserve? Yes. Dumbledore sounded decidedly testy. There was a small stack of paperwork on his desk bearing the seals of the ICW. Well, her mate apparently flew off a day later, in the same direction. The inkwell on Dumbledore's desk shattered. Professor Dumbledore? What? The snap demand came from behind a large pile of paperwork on the headmaster's desk. Not only ICW paperwork, but also from Romania, Hungary, Croatia, Bulgaria, Kosovo, Serbia, Armenia, Bosnia, Montenegro, and several ministry departments. The headmaster had been decidedly unhappy since Hagrid had cheerfully cleared a portion of the forbidden forest for the Horntails, who were expected any day now, and was now making giant base nets for the inevitable brood. There is a complaint from several African governments about the unexplained disappearance of a Nundu. Percy trailed off in the face of Dumbledore's glare. The Horntails arrived with little fanfare. Considering that the students had seen one of the species recently, there wasn't much to be interested in. Professor Potter had been asked by several people including Fleur to please not use them for his classes, so the two had settled in, and Hagrid had gleefully reported that there was probably going to be a clutch soon. Dumbledore had stormed from the Great Hall at that point. Prof's dash. What? The chairs in the room were now stacked with paperwork as well. Many things. I have reports of an exsanguinated Riem in America, and a tailless manticore in Greece. That's the best of the lot. Explain. Some of the paperwork began to smolder. A giant at a reserve had its arms cut off. Someone went to the Dragon Preserve in Eastern Europe, killed and skinned a Ukrainian iron belly, and beheaded an adolescent Hungarian horntail. The Nepalese report that a Yeti had its legs removed. A dead Nundu was found in the Sahara without its liver. Oh, and the head, legs, and tail of a chimera were left lying in a temple in Greece again. Get out. The flow flared to life. The person who looked through it found an office which was apparently made of paperwork. All furniture had vanished under the mounds. Professor Dumbledore, the voice was that of Ilvermorny headmaster Fontaine. I must lodge a complaint. Yes? Despite his annoyance, there were a few people in the world that Dumbledore would usually make time for. Still, he was on his last nerve. One of your professors came to my school and murdered our mascots. What? My Thunderbird had its wings cut off, the horned serpent's jewel was ripped from its forehead, and my Wumpus had its eyes plucked out. And he just killed the Pugwudgie too, and I quote here, complete the set. Why do you think it was one of my people, Fontaine? I don't know, Dumbledore. It's just a suspicion I have. Also that he introduced himself as1. He could have faked dash. With your signature. Just walked up to the groundskeeper, said I'm a visiting scholar from Hogwarts, can you please show me to your mascots? If I ever see Professor Potter on my grounds again, I will kill him. The fluss snuffed out. Then the paperwork in the office burst into flames. Girl Toby turned up 2 days before the end of the task to less fanfare and more terror as she led a live Nundu onto the grounds. Hagrid had wept with joy. Dumbledore just wept. 10 minutes before the task was completed, Professor Potter strolled up from the dungeons leading a hulking brutish creature covered in grey hide and sporting broad, feathered wings. The dragon's head had slit-pupilled eyes and more than animal intelligence in them. Hi, Professor Dumbledore. The voice was deep and booming, coming from a chest the size of a small car. At the incredulous look, it went on. Dement, sir? I graduated last year. Dumbledore's stony expression grew somehow darker as he registered the name and realized what was standing in front of him. I call it the improved Chimer Dash. Crumb wins. Dumbledore glared at the judges until they all nodded. Good. Then he stormed back to his office. There hadn't been trouble with the creation by Professor Potter. Trouble was far too mild a term for the chaos that followed. Most of the world didn't notice, and even most magicals were completely unaware of the whole thing. Those few who were engaged in actual legislative activity, as opposed to the majority of legislators, who tend to exhibit little in the way of independent thought. As required in order to get anything done in a committee of more than about 10, in certain specific kinds of regulation, and the members of the ICW, however, were going without sleep. The chamber of the ICW, located in an unused janitorial closet in the basement of the UN, was in an uproar as the debate raged. The subject was whether the new species was a violation of bans on breeding of magical creatures or not. A collection of delegates were arguing that despite the obviously troubling nature of the monster, that this was not actually breeding per se, and so necessitated the passing of new legislation, which would probably be negotiated over wine at a nice local restaurant. Others were insisting that as the creature was allegedly fertile that this qualified as sufficiently breeding-like to warrant sanction. Albus Dumbledore had kept quiet. As far as he was concerned, this would be best chalked up to it being HarryPotter violating not the law, but just reality in general. Since the ICW was unlikely to tolerate such a concept, and was made of career diplomats who never considered their day complete unless they had spent several hours in debate, defined as shouting over everyone else so that the democratic process could be affected, he contented himself with putting in earplugs, conjuring a barrier against flying spittle, and had instead sat down with some of the more skilled barristers on staff to begin drafting new laws regarding the creation of new species. Without direct breeding. No doubt, what actually passed would not contain a word of this original, but when he presented it to them, they might at least argue over something productive. Not that he thought a detail like making it illegal would stop HarryPotter from doing whatever he pleased. There was a certain petty pleasure in knowing that these people were getting worked up over something akin to trying to legislate the path of a hurricane. Dumbledore looked up with mild interest as the American delegation got some news which did not seem to make them happy. He edged over to them and removed his earplugs. Apparently, someone in the American ministry had decided to try and sort out the underlying problem by putting down the monster. Considering that this was a creation made by Professor Potter and, from what Dumbledore had gathered, inhabited by an adult wizard trained by Professor Potter, he was unsurprised to learn that the effort had resulted in a large number of dead wizards. It was only a matter of time before the Americans tried to demand extradition, so they could kill it, or just made a spirited attempt to kidnap the damn thing. He walked away, mentally noting that the United States was likely to have a substantially lower number of hit wizards shortly. Boss. Arnold looked over the once-and future employee of the Dawn. When you said you needed to borrow him, I had expected to get him back. He is back. Say hello to Arnold. Hello. Arnold sighed and sat down at his desk. He wasn't sure what to make of the monstrous figurine that had appeared on his desk a week ago. Really, Cornelius, the voice was saccharine. It's clear that Dumbledore must be up to something. There have been so many incidents over the past few years. Now nearly all your trainee Aurors are fanatically loyal to one of his people. He's plotting. I don't know. Fudge looked at his brandy glass. He'd spent the morning being harangued by the Yank representatives to the ICW for an incident in the colonies. There had been the time that was normally reserved for pre-lunch tea and meetings with the Magical Creatures Department head about new domestic regulation, and lunch had been with Dumbledore and that twit Fobbins who was the UK representative to the ICW on international creature regulations. For some reason that no one had quite explained to him, there was a pressing need to regulate the combining of species without breeding them. He didn't understand how that worked, but he'd agreed to support their proposals because the meal had been disgusting, and he wanted to get to his office and maybe at least have a cold breakfast and a nap. Instead, he'd been headed off by Lucius Malfoy, who he'd been rather short with because it had been days since he got a full 12 hours of sleep and had a decent meal. Whatever Dumbledore was doing, it was surely causing him trouble. Now, he was sitting in his office and trying to have a quiet meal, and his undersecretary had decided now was the perfect time to talk about Dumbledore and the Auror problem. Dumbledore has been really unhappy recently. I don't think he's much more thrilled about this whole breeding mess than I am. Possibly more upset, because he seems to be mixed up in it, Dolores. He's clever as all. It's a ruse to hide his plans, Minister. But I'm sure you saw through it straight away. I did? Fudge closed his eyes. He didn't want to look foolish. I mean, of course I did. He's up to something. Fine. What am I supposed to do about Albus Dumbledore? He's popular. Well, we can see to that. There's been lots of trouble recently, after all. And it's all related to Hogwarts. It's his fault, you know. He's been trying to discredit you. I can't be having that. Fudge knocked back his drink. I'm sure you have a plan, she prompted. Like appointing someone to the defense post, perhaps. Someone who will make sure they learn less fanatic violence and more loyalty and trust in the ministry? I know she'd be perfect, the speaker perked up. But I can't spare Amelia Bones. She scowled. She's one of the few veteran Aurors who hasn't retired in the last 2 years. I meant that you were probably thinking of someone with more of an eye to more traditional values? Who knows the importance of blood? Of course. I can't believe I didn't think of it sooner. Do you think Lucius would mind the job? Umbridge closed her eyes and silently prayed to whoever would listen that her boss would stop missing the point. Perhaps, she said through gritted teeth. You might want to consider someone who would instill loyalty to you, Cornelius. She hoped the man would get the bloody hint before she wrote it on a conjured brick and bashed his head in with it. Sasuke approached the designated spot with trepidation. He wasn't sure what to make of the letter. Brother. It has come time to fight and prove my strength. Come to Clan Bunker 17. Love. Itachi. P.S. You've outgrown sound. Resign. Since the letter had managed to find him in a secret sound bunker that was supposed to be, well, secret, he got the impression that if Itachi had wanted to kill him, that would have been the time. Still, he'd tendered his resignation from sound. In the Uchiha tradition. He wasn't generally a fan of his clan, but sometimes they had the right idea. Besides, Sasuke rather liked the grass cutter and was happy to have acquired it in the process. He was on guard and his eyes were alight and ready to fight. Which was why he was surprised to find a small table, 2 chairs, 2 saucers, and a jug of sake. And his brother. Hello, little brother. Itachi poured each of them a saucer. He coughed and Sasuke saw the blood flecking at his lips. Sit. Time is short and there are some important things to go over. He knocked back his sake and poured another. Sasuke approached warily, sword drawn. I'm not doing too well. Itachi showed his brother the blood that had speckled his hand. I'm dying, Sasuke. I have been for a while. I managed to make it this long on willpower and my son needing me. Now sit down. Sasuke sat. The village ordered the massacre. The clan was rebelling. I know. Oh. Itachi looked somewhat wrong-footed. This isn't how I was expecting this to go. Somehow I expected more anger. Our clan were a seriously poisonous bunch of monsters. The world's better off without them. Okay. That helps a bit. Itachi paused. You need to join the Akatsuki. I what? Otherwise, we won't have a spy when I'm gone. Sasuke goggled at his brother. Otherwise, Lord Jiraiya won't have any information on what the Akatsuki are doing. Oh. Sasuke thought that about covered it. You need to know that the man in charge isn't the one who claims to be the leader. It's a man wearing an orange mask who calls himself Uchiha Madara. He's dangerous enough to be. Head to Rain and make yourself useful to him. Do whatever you have to in order to stay close. Itachi produced a scroll. Sasuke opened it. Signed by the third was a long-term assignment to the Akatsuki as an S-ranked mission and clearance to commit treason in service of his cover. Now, let's make sure you're ready for the Akatsuki, little brother. Sasuke leapt back as Itachi upended the table, and the world began to burn. Itachi's smile was bitter as Sasuke removed the sword from his chest. I'm sorry, Sasuke. But you need these eyes in order to face him. He coughed. I'm sorry I left you behind, but I didn't want to taint you with disloyalty. Promise you'll look after my son for me. His eyes slowly closed. Sasuke took a deep breath as bloody tears ran down his face. Goodbye, big brother. He exhaled white-hot flames over the body. Chapter 99, We're Not Dead. 2 champions sat in the small office. Fleur and Hari had not been amused to find that Girl Toby had decided to forego the briefing on Sasori's last mission. Crumb had only just landed when the meeting was announced and had promptly turned around and flown off again with Millie clinging to him. The briefing was, well, brief. You have been informed of the ultimate objective of the hunt. I have no clues for you this time. It will be up to you to figure it out on your own. Remember that this is not a mission to be handled with a hammer. Sasori was looking at Hari when he said the last bit. I will drop off the missive with your second. He rose and left. It feels like this is stacked against me, Fleur said. Arnold reviewed the short set of instructions. That's all we have to go on, is it? Sasori nodded. Well, it will be good to get this dealt with. He picked up the phone and dialed. Kirkbane. Congratulations on another priority job. I'm sending you the particulars. Let me be clear on this, if you fuck up, you can tell the boss you failed. From the earpiece, Sasori heard a superlatively attractive voice say, Is that Arnold? Give me the PH dash, then the clack of Arnold hastily putting the phone in its cradle. Do I want to know? I don't want to know. Hari watched with satisfaction as his students engaged in independent study. Those in 5th year and below had begun a live-fire skirmish on the lawn, and were making a spirited effort to turn it into a series of earthworks and fortifications which constantly changed hands with the allegiances of the combatants. His 6th years were engaged in advanced field practice of their medical techniques, patching up the younger students and occasionally corralling a stray brat back onto the lawn. Those who were bucking for every bit of extra credit, which was a necessity to be accepted into the Orus these days, were wading into the fight to administer first aid to the wounded. So far, there had been no permanent injuries, and Hari was conflicted as to whether this was a good thing. The 7th years had deployed en masse to the Forbidden Forest to engage in an acromantula hunt. At some point, he was going to have to step in and curtail these forays, lest the colony be too depleted to serve as training for future students. You're a monster fair letting them hurt innocent creatures, declared the half-giant beside him. Evening, Hagrid. I wanted to talk to you about that, actually. Do you think you could erect some sort of fence around the colony? I guess. While you're here, I've been thinking. I understand you are responsible for the Scroats? Hari watched one of the creatures explode into the combat, blasting a fortification to pieces and sending students flying. I rather like them, though they are lacking in imagination. Do you think that if I procured some breeding pairs, you could make something more inventive? The armor, for example, is nice. Hari observed several piercing hexes gouge chunks out of the scrot without doing lasting harm. Have a list ready for me by dinner. That will be all, Hagrid. The man trotted away, unsure of how to feel about the prospect of breeding more victims for Professor Potter. And how much he was even more terrified of telling the young professor no. Hari settled himself on the ground and focused. There was one spell that was nearly required for Auror trainees as of last year. He had not worked out how to cast the Patronus. His preference for using unmitigated violence was unfortunately not an acceptable replacement. The theory was simple enough, but he wondered if there was some experiential component that was missing. He hated not being able to teach that, but so far, he'd left it to Moody to handle that class. Protective thoughts, protective thoughts, protective. Everyone stopped to stare at the 20-foot-tall figure made of green fire that was suddenly standing in the middle of the lawn. It carried a long, nearly straight blade in one giant hand, the other was empty, but had claws. The single eye in its head was a glowing crimson flame. Red wings sprouted from its back, speckled with black, white, and green. A long, yellow mustache drooped from under its mask. Strangely, its armor was a mottled, tortoiseshell pattern. Hey, Uncle Sasori. Look what I can do. Hari turned his head, the giant's turning with it. Do you mind? The spellfire died away. Sorry, Professor. The month that followed was one of great, if sometimes hidden, excitement throughout the world. Secure facilities were breached in record numbers, many of them without notice for a week or more, and confidential information was recovered and used to identify further targets with impressive ruthlessness. There was an uptick in the number of people working at totally not secure government facilities being checked into institutions for the insane, most of them gibbering messes. Tentacles were mentioned with frequency unusual in such cases. At the same time, a few people received gifts in the mail which turned out to be far less helpful than a mere monkey's paw, and one man received a literal monkey's paw. It did not end well. With the exception of an incident near the Arc de Triomphe involving an omnibus full of school children, another incident in Sydney which drew the attention of the constabulary to an operation engaged in koala smuggling, and a final one in the London Opera which quite ruined the final aria. The more active surprise was confined primarily to that class of persons who are definitely not working for shadowy government agencies. Among such persons, though, it generally accepted that something was going on, though what exactly it was did not make itself known for quite some time. Harry presented Sasori with a small figurine. "Well, you managed to complete an assignment." Sasori nodded. Dumbledore stood at the head table. "We have somehow managed to go all the way to June without losing anyone important." The two headmasters beside him began to protest. "Anyone important?" he shouted to be heard over them. "So it is with great surprise that I find myself announcing that all competitors are going to be entering into the final task tomorrow evening. In order to ensure that this will be as entertaining as possible, the event is to take place in a hedge maze, which has been rendered magically opaque at the request of the Ministry's Department of Fun Police. Some of you know it as magical games and sports." At that point, Dumbledore had to stop speaking because he couldn't be heard over the twins' gales of laughter, produced by an experimental device that blew winds of canned laughter through an area. As the scores stand, Girl Toby is in first place, followed by Victor Crumb. Mademoiselle Delacour is in third, and in a distant fourth is Professor Potter. As such, Ms. Girl Toby will be entering the maze first. It will be the objective of the champions to reach the center and return with the Tri-Wizard Cup. Though since there are 4 wizards, it seems odd that we have continued to refer to this as Tri-Wizard. Especially as there are 2 witches. He sat down and was about to pick up a fork when it apparently occurred to him that he had not actually made the announcement he'd intended. Dumbledore sprang back to his feet. As such, the third task is taking place in a week's time. Attendance is mandatory. I think that covers it. Oh yes, Quidditch finals will be delayed this year as their normal date happens to be in the middle of event preparations. I trust this will not be too much of an issue." He sat down once more and began to serve himself food from the platters nearest to him. Students filed out to the Quidditch pitch for the final task. Several, Ronald Weasley chief among them, were vocally horrified at the desecration of the sacred pitch. Most students let it go and made for seats out of the wind. The general consensus was that at least Professor Dumbledore had alerted them ahead of time that there would be nothing to see. The upper years, among whom thinking ahead was not merely encouraged, but absolutely required if one wished to see graduation, brought homework with them. Hermione brought several books that she swore she hadn't memorized, despite having an eidetic memory. Of those not paying attention, the Slytherins in proximity to Tam were warily observing her fiddling with a wooden cube. No one had any reason to expect something horrible to happen as a result. Unlike Professor Potter, Tam usually didn't say things like "good thing I didn't blow up the room again." On the other hand, it was Rune's work assigned by Professor Potter. Even if it worked right, there was no reason to think that meant it worked safe. Girl Toby blinked when the bell chimed and had to be prompted several times to enter the maze. She insisted that it was dark and spooky in there. No one believed her, of course. But she had to be firmly informed that participation was not an optional activity. She proceeded to skip into the darkness, chirping happily in a vaguely annoying tune that Professor Dumbledore was certain would either ward off monsters by sheer aggravation or drive them to attempt to murder the girl to make her shut up. Victor Crumb promptly made the fun police liars by ignoring the chime and grabbing Millie before hopping on a broom and flying on a straight line towards Milan. He yelled out that he was going to see if the Italians had stolen the cup and put it in a tourist attraction or nice hotel. When Fleur entered the maze, it was to no fanfare, but the sound of hedges catching alight. Her progress, or lack thereof, was marked by the charred, smoking plant matter which failed to stay burned long enough for her to force her way through. Apparently, when no one was looking, Professor Potter had taken it upon himself to make sure that the maze was up to snuff. Thus, it was that almost a full hour after Fleur entered the maze, Harry strolled in, looking mildly interested for the short time it took for him to decide that unlike Fleur, the maze was going to do as he wished. The gouts of purple flame were only mildly alarming to most of the assemblage, which had grown used to the wielding of hellish fires as a standard tool over the last several years. It turned out that even enhanced by Professor Potter, Fleur was unable to make it to the center of the maze. Dumbledore had taken some time the night before to enchant and re-enchant the entire thing, until it was more akin to a part of Hogwarts than greenery. That was why he was unsurprised to find Professor Potter absently burning his way right through. The castle knew better than to get in his way. Dumbledore was beginning to develop a theory that there were no secret passages where Professor Potter found them, but the castle merely adapted to avoid annoying him. Harry watched the Acromantula scuttle away from him in terror as he approached the cup. It was covered in a strange set of magical enchantments that he was pretty sure he'd seen before. When he reached out, he got to enjoy being dragged by his navel into an instant of flashing light. He came out of it dodging the red beam of light that flew at him. There was a popping sound, and all that was left in the graveyard with him was an ugly infant which began to rant maniacally. Harry shrugged and snapped its neck before beginning the trek back to the school. He figured it would take him a few hours. Albus Dumbledore wasn't sure why he was surprised. He really wasn't. A moment or two after, the maze informed him that Professor Potter had been whisked away from the grounds, which was part of the plan, though he made sure to act surprised. A small hand had tugged on his robe, and a masked girl had held out a Triwizard Cup and asked if they were looking for it. Pain had finally had enough of Itachi's failure to bring the Ninetales into the Akatsuki's grasp. He had already begun mobilizing when the news came in that Itachi had been killed by his younger brother. That was a bit odd, really. Unless Itachi had been slipping, there shouldn't have been any chance. Unless Sasori's reports were inaccurate. Or late. Again. That was a distinct possibility. The ultimatum he gave to Leaf was simple: they had an hour to turn over what he wanted, or he would begin to systematically destroy the village. He thought it was a reasonable offer. 2 hours later, he found that he was taking a very different deal. He smiled a little at the blond boy who stood in front of him. He'd been passionate in a way that Nagato hadn't managed in years. It was a relief in a way. Still, as he gathered his power into his eyes and tried to avoid looking at the tears running down Conan's cheeks, he just had to say it. I blame my nephew for this. Chapter 100, Home is Never the Same. When Harry turned up with the cup, it made for a certain amount of paperwork. Dumbledore couldn't say he was entirely surprised by the duplication, though. The Ministry had to take a fair bit of convincing that they really couldn't tell the difference between the two cups and therefore were technically faced with two winners. Thankfully, Mr. Greengrass had taken possession of his daughter's winnings once the Ministry had been persuaded to pay out double prizes. Professor Potter had been rather stoic about it and mostly complained about the final task being too easy. In fairness, there had been no serious injuries, let alone any deaths, during this tournament, and that was well behind the curve. Harry closed out the year teaching classes to his attentive and slightly terrified students with a sense of satisfaction. It was a lot more fun than he'd ever really expected it to be. Instead of being frustrated with the utter incompetence that he had to start with, he just enjoyed seeing them grow and learn how to properly slaughter a fellow human in a heartbeat. Professor Dumbledore had impressed upon him a lesson similar to that of several of his uncles: to avoid civilian casualties. Professor Dumbledore hadn't phrased it the same way. Instead of reminding him he wasn't paid for collateral deaths, he had focused on the idea of actually protecting civilians. Harry didn't mind that, in the end. Technically, a large number of missions were protection. It was just that he'd never really been along on them. or had them assigned to him. So he'd actually had to do a bit of learning himself as he prepared the lesson plans for the upper years. Hogwarts saw what was no longer a record number of O.W.L.S. and N.E.W.T.S. as students made sure not to disappoint Professor Potter, and the Aurors had what was becoming the usual end-of-year flood of job applications from graduates, some of them with rather disturbing letters of recommendation from Professor Potter, or slightly less worrying, only a little, letters from Auror, Ret, Moody. At breakfast before the students left, Dumbledore rose and cleared his throat, then exploded a conjured buffalo to get attention. "Thank you for attending the last meal of the school year. I'm glad to see that all of you are leaving. Despite my expectations, we have not faced some students repeating a year, so I offer a word of thanks to you for not extending the length of time I'll have to deal with you snot-nosed brats. I feel it only fair to inform all of you that the Hogwarts Express has just departed the station for King's Cross. You will all need to both arrange alternate methods of returning to your hovels, and to raise the funds to pay for trespassing on my grounds." He sat down and went back to his toast. Half the students fled the hall, while the other half apparently decided that if they'd already missed the express, there was no point in missing the rest of their breakfast and returned to their meals and conversations. Konan was unsure of what to expect, but she'd been rehearsing the whole story in her head for days. Madara was out doing things, and she was waiting for her nephew to return to the tower so she could explain what had happened in the last 10 months. Every time she glanced at Nagato's body, laying out on the meeting table, the tears started again. She understood why he did it, she really did. The blonde Uchiha was exactly who Nagato had wanted to be when Yahiko died. He'd never had the knack for being kind and believing that the world could be good. One talk with Uchiha Naruto had proved that there was someone like Yahiko left in the world, one who didn't just want a better world, but believed it could be achieved with every fiber of his being. It was a faith that could move mountains. It had moved Nagato's heart, at least. She didn't blame him. Not for the deaths. Not for giving himself to undo what he'd done. Konan smiled through the tears. He had died as he hadn't lived, happy and believing in a future. She couldn't ask for more for her best friend. He'd been at peace, and even now, his face had none of the hard lines and darkness that had been fixed there in life. "Hey and Kona" the voice trailed off as Hari finished appearing in the tower and saw what lay on the table. The pile of gifts fell to the ground in a jumble as he approached. "What happened?" The prepared speech just failed her as she looked at him. There was a new expression on her nephew's face, something mixing confusion, disbelief, and pain. It occurred to her that he'd never had someone important die before. To her, it had become a fact of life that caring about people left her vulnerable. Hari, her nephew, had never needed to worry about that with his family. "Who could hurt the Akatsuki? Who do I kill?" The words were snarled out, and the air started to grow heavy with power as the pain was shuffled off to make room for the easier, safer emotion of anger. "No one," Konan said quietly. "He died resurrecting people he decided he shouldn't have killed." She felt the tears running again at the confusion that had returned to Hari's face. He made a mistake and spent his life to undo it. He shook his head. But dead? He wasn't staring at his uncle's body, but he didn't need to. "That was the price," Konan mumbled. "He didn't mind paying it, Hari." Oh. It was clear Hari didn't really understand. "He's not the only one, Hari." "Not the only one what?" "Dead, Hari. Kakuzu and Haydn were killed a month or so ago. Deidara is missing. Sasori Uncle Sasori is in the other world now. He helps run the branch organization." Oh. It was Conan's turn to be confused. "The rest aren't, though, Hari. I'm sure that Kakuzu and Haydn were killed, and I haven't heard from Deidara in months." He looked stunned again, but she mustered courage to finish the list. "And your father, it was going to kill him. Itachi died 2 weeks ago." To her surprise, Hari shook his head. "Dad's not dead. Hari. He can't die. Nothing can kill Dad. Konan shook her head and reached out to hug her nephew. Everything had gone to pieces around her. The Akatsuki was disintegrating. Madara had apparently begun recruiting Uchiha Sasuke the moment that Itachi had died. Her best friend was dead. Hari, though, she took comfort in knowing that Hari wasn't going to join the list anytime soon. Not if she could help it. You can't stay. She said it quietly. Of course I can. No. Hari. You can't stay. You have to go back to the other world. She hoped he didn't ask why. She couldn't tell him that his favorite uncle was possibly the most evil man in the world and was planning to do things she was now sure were absolutely wrong. Hari nodded, not really sure what was going on. And Konan seemed to have an idea of what to do, and he was a bit too lost right now to argue much. He gently detached himself from her and walked over to his uncle's body. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he told the corpse. I was supposed to train until I was ready and earn it. This feels like cheating. I know Uncle Sasori says I can't really cheat, but it still feels like I'm just being handed this. We were supposed to destroy Rain with our fight, Uncle Pain. It was supposed to be an epic battle. The Sharingan spun wildly and something hot and sticky trailed down one side of his face. Go on, Hari, Konan murmured. She watched with a carefully controlled expression as her nephew reached down and extracted Nagato's left eye. It was done with a great deal of skill and precision. Her nephew had grown, it seemed. She was less prepared to watch him casually pluck out his own Byakugan eye and begin the process of attaching the new eye in its place. It was surreal, really, to watch. One eye was leaking blood that he didn't seem to notice, but he had absently sealed the spare eye into his wrist, and then begun the surgical procedure right there. It barely took 5 minutes for him to have a complex, borderline legendary, eye implanted into his skull. The mismatched gaze was somehow older. It was painful to see it on Hari's face. I'm sorry. Konan closed her eyes and was surprised to find herself wrapped in a hug initiated by her nephew. He'd never been one for gestures like that before. Promise me you won't die, Hari. Everyone seems to die around me. I need you to promise you won't be one of them. I'm not going to die, and Konan. I promise. The voice was soothing. Something relaxed in her chest. She knew he was strong, but right now, she could believe that Hari would do just what he said. He always did. If he promised not to die, then she could be sure he wasn't going anywhere. No one could warp reality like him. Konan pushed him away. Now get going. She wanted him gone before Madara got back. Just because she believed him didn't mean she wanted to test it. Goodbye, Hari. I'll see you next summer, and Konan. Just as the fire surrounded him, he heard Konan speak again. Goodbye, Hari. Arnold looked up to see what turned out to be the most terrifying thing to date. His boss was glaring at him. He had a new eye too, but it was the glare. There was more emotion in that look than he'd seen from Professor Potter in several years of knowing him. Give me a job. Right away. Something really violent. I'm going to kill someone, so I should get paid for it. Arnold held out a folder and watched his boss vanish in a cloud of fire. He decided not to comment on the trail of blood from his old eye, nor the blood smeared around the new one. This was not a time to ask his boss anything. Mr. Sasori? Yes. Sasori hadn't bothered to poke his head out when Hari had arrived, but was mildly surprised that he hadn't visited him. I don't know what just happened. It was cathartic. It really was. Hari stood in the ruins of a warlord's encampment, not even breathing hard. There was nothing around him for almost a mile. Nothing but scorched earth and a fine, white ash. He'd burned the place, over and over. All he could see was his Uncle Pain lying there dead. He'd looked at peace too. But he was just as dead as if he'd been angry or sad or scared. Dead was dead. So he'd burned the entire area to the ground and set fire to the ashes, and then scoured the ash with more fire, until the whole area was devoid of anything but him. On second thought, it didn't help. He was still just as angry and confused. Why hadn't Konan wanted him to stay? He should have stayed. Something was wrong. And the damned bird refused to bring him back. It hadn't even responded to him for days. Not since it had dropped him off here. And so he burned the place some more. It didn't tax his reserves, not even a little. He just kept letting out flames. He hadn't wanted to go back to the office to get another job. He didn't really want to go destroy a city. Actually, he did. What he wanted to do right now was destroy everything in the world. But that would include destroying the Dawn and Daphne and Hermione and Blaze and Tracy and Millie and Pansy, and it would destroy their families, and they'd be unhappy too. He couldn't set fire to the world. Even if he didn't set fire to England and Scotland, if he burned the rest of it, he'd have no more jobs for the Dawn. He turned the massive clearing into a conflagration again, this time blasting the land clean with fiend fire. There was a spell that fit his mood. Right now, when he cast that spell, he could feel the black tide of anger and pain rise up in him, but then it would spill out into a roiling mass of monstrous creatures that rent the land with claws and fangs. While they rampaged, the emotions in him were gone, lashing out at the world instead of him. He thrust out a hand and the clearing turned into a crater as an invisible fist of the gods slammed into the earth. Ash flew into the wind as he repeated the strike over and over, blasting the crater with force. He didn't speak while he did. He just let out a long, incoherent scream that went beyond rage and sadness and left him limbed with fiend fire while he blasted away. He didn't cry, not really. He'd seen crying, and it wasn't what he was doing. But he felt the sticky heat running down his face as he ran out of air and sat down, staring at the ruins. Konan smiled weakly until Hari was gone. It was good to know he was gone from here. He'd have been devastated by Madara. Instead, she sat calmly and waited. She didn't have any friends left. The remaining members of the Akatsuki were Hashigake, who was an ally of convenience at best, and Madara. She hadn't been friends with most of them anyway. She'd barely had any friends at all. The only one left was Hari, and she'd made sure he was safe from this. It was a surprise to find that she had run out of tears when he left. She didn't need to cry anymore. Everything was going just as it had always been destined to go. She and Nagato hadn't changed their fates, they hadn't even stalled them. This was how things were always supposed to end. Hello, Madara. She kept her face blank as he faded into reality. He stared at the corpse for a long minute. Where is the other eye? He wasn't pretending to be Toby anymore. This was the cold, malicious voice of Uchiha Madara. Konan was surprised to find that she could smile. Guess. The one visible eye blinked. Hard dash and she triggered the explosive tags, consuming her world in flames. Albus Dumbledore had a horrible feeling in his hip. It always felt like that when something really bad was going to happen. He didn't know what it was, but it wasn't a good feeling. In addition to his discomfort, he was also experiencing the unusual sensation of being completely and totally confused. He knew what Hari had reported and had headed out here just as soon as he could. It had been a day at best, no one should have been coming to this nowhere cemetery in the back end of just as much nowhere. It hadn't been hard to guess which cemetery it was either. What confused him was the total lack of a corpse. Chapter 101, Holiday Gift to Our Patient, Lovely Readers. The damned bird still wasn't responding to him. Hari glowered murderously at airport security until they decided they had better things to do than search the 15-year-old traveling on his own. It was keeping him from going home to check on Aunt Konan. When he'd had a chance to think about it, she'd seemed too off. He didn't know what was wrong with her, but it made something itch in his chest, and he wanted to make sure she was okay. Instead, he was forced to rely on his people just to find out where his friends were so he could visit them. Hermione was just about done with this. She'd put up with her family being followed for a week already, but it was getting on her nerves. The two men clearly thought they were doing a good job of blending into their surroundings. She'd give them that at least they weren't wearing federal agent suits or brightly colored robes, but anyone trained by Harry would notice. At least if they could use magic to keep up a steady stream of detection charms, and she was in the habit of using one that allowed her to track everyone within a fairly wide radius. Most people couldn't use it the way she did, but an eidetic memory meant that she remembered every return she'd had. The two had been following them since they'd gotten to the airport in London. "I'll be back, Mum." She pulled on a bathrobe and stepped away from the pool. Disillusionment was easy enough for her, and she tiptoed back into the hotel and up to the third floor. It wasn't even a moment's work to work out which room they were in. The door was warded to hell and back, so she broke into the room next to it and transfigured a hole in the wall. She didn't say anything to them until she'd stunned the both of them. It was more difficult than she'd been expecting, and if she'd had a wand, there would have been a tremendous problem. As it was, whatever wards they'd thrown up had been enough to keep the staff from noticing a pitched battle in the room. Once the two were disarmed, bound, and thoroughly disabled, she walked into their line of sight. "Can I help you two gentlemen?" She sat down on their bed and crossed her arms. "I don't appreciate being followed by whatever organization sent you. You're too muggle for it to be Death Eaters, and I don't know who else would bother." "Miss Granger," said one with sandy hair. The boss is going to kill us." Assuming he gets the chance, Hermione pointed out mildly. "Well, when he finds out the principal caught us, he's going to be upset." "Princey, are you telling me you two are bodyguards?" The one with darker hair nodded. "We work for the Dawn. Our boss assigned us to keep an eye on you. I don't know why, you seem perfectly able to take care of yourself." "The Dawn?" "Yeah. You're a nice girl, miss, so you probably wouldn't have heard of us. But we work for Professor Potter." "He sent guards?" "No, Mississippi. That was our boss, Mississippi." "I see. And do you have a way to prove this?" "Technically? No. I mean, I have the business card in my pocket, and you could call the main office. Well, Mr. Sasori might be in. Would that help?" "Indeed." Hermione walked to the phone. "That number, please?" Harry didn't question why Arnold had exact locations for all his friends. Instead, he merely broke into one of the more warded magical prisons on the continent to visit Millie. He observed as she waded into a riot that was bubbling nicely and proceeded to batter men into states of shock that replicated unconsciousness. "Hey, Harry. Things going well?" "Yep." Mill bashed a man a little too hard and scowled as his skull partially caved in. "Damn. That's going to come out of my pay." Harry was glad to know that at least Daphne and Astoria were reliably at home. Apparently, no one had bothered to add him to the wards, so he broke in there too. He found the two of them eating breakfast. Well, Daphne was eating breakfast. Astoria had presumably finished her breakfast and was gleefully chasing the Nunda cub, who was in turn chasing a garden gnome that it was apparently allowing to live solely to torment. Hello, Daphne." "Harry." Her tone was unwelcoming at best. "It seems that she knew you were coming." I have no other explanation for why she managed to guzzle syrup straight from the pitcher this morning. As such, I blame you for the headache already beginning. "Harry." Girl Toby came racing up to him to bounce in place. "Anything interesting happen?" Apparently Hermione was being tailed by a couple of mercenary wizards. She caught them. Harry had been torn when he got that report. There had been no good answer to who he would want to win either way. Someone he wanted to win had to lose. Should I be worried about that? I doubt it. Blaze didn't even look up. "Mother is out on a date," he said. He'd heard the sound of the window opening, and when nothing had died from the entral expeller he'd tossed in its direction, he decided that it was Harry. Is there anything else you want? He was reading a book and apparently quite invested in it. Just checking in. Well, I'm not sure. She's still pulling for us to date though. I've tried to convince her that she will probably have grandchildren, but I can't say that's gotten through to her. You're not my type, Blaze. Somehow, that is at the bottom of my list of reasons, Harry. Tracy was blissfully enjoying sleep when she felt someone enter her room and instinctively threw a piercing hex at it. Good, you didn't use your wand. Tracy yelped. Damn it, Harry. I've been enjoying getting to sleep in. That's a terrible habit to be in. Pansy had been having a terrible summer. Her parents had been especially aggressive in trying to re-educate her on the proper behavior for a good pure-blood girl. There was only so much of it she could take. She wished she knew why they were suddenly pushing it so hard though. Nothing had changed that she knew of aside from getting older. Technically, they might be worried that she was coming up to an age where they could marry her off, but she couldn't imagine that any pure-blood family would want her. To get away from the orders and disapproving stares, she'd taken to riding her bike all the way to London and roaring around ignoring the attempts to pull her over. That was how she ended up in this alleyway, which she discovered was a dead end with a bunch of bikers gathered around the entrance, all looking rather mean. Look at what we've got here, one of them called. Pansy scowled, he sounded drunk. Bitch on a bike like she's got a right to be there. Pansy didn't wait for the rest of the drunken group to start talking. She'd already identified the leader. Her gun came up and drilled 2 large rounds into the man's chest, and put a third into the middle of his forehead as he pitched backwards, showering several men behind him in brains. Before any of you get the bright idea to rush me, just consider that I was really overambitious with the 3 shots to him. I have plenty of rounds left in the mag and several more at my hip. If you rush me, I can probably put most of you down before you're even off your bikes. Now, you can either make me waste ammo and litter this entire place with corpses, or you can go the fuck on your way and leave me alone. There was some quiet conferring. Look, if you don't pick in another 10 seconds, I'll start shooting people until you make up your minds. After a few more seconds of hurried discussion, one of the large, rather hairy men raised a hand. Can we pick option 3? The fuck is option 3? Pansy ejected the magazine from her gun, a fresh one sliding into place in a blink. You run the gang? The fuck? Harry had been planning to stop in and see Pansy, but he got a call from Arnold about an urgent job in London. Technically, it could be farmed out to someone else, but Arnold had been adamant that Harry take it himself. He kicked in the door to the bar. Hello, jackasses. I'm looking for the Bloody Rose. If you'll kindly point them out to me, I'll leave with a minimum of killing the rest of you. Hi, Harry. Pansy? Harry sat down at a rather beaten table at the back of a bar that smelled of unwashed humans, alcohol, and tobacco smoke, watching as Pansy lit up a cigarette and took a pull from a bottle of whiskey. You've been busy. It's something to pass the time. And it keeps me out of the house. So, I have a contract to kill you. And I'm not dead. Yes. Well. One-time offer. If you'll pick up some of the fee, I'll go deliver a rejection in clear terms. Is it by any chance one of the other gangs? Probably. Done. Pansy smiled to herself and lit a cigarette, taking a drag as she reread the headlines in the paper. Bloody Rose breaks bones. The warehouse that had been a haven for the enemy club had been burned to the ground with all hands, save one who'd been nailed to a wall with a rose carved into his back. Her parents would have been appalled at her satisfaction, not the violence, especially not to muggles, but the fact that it had been done by hand. That was barbarism in their eyes. She wished she'd been the one to do the carving, but she didn't have Harry's talent for art. Her glance flicked up at the boy in question. He was brooding. She'd never seen that before. He'd plotted, planned, precipitated chaos, and generally been up to something most of the time she'd known him, but she'd never seen him brood. For that matter, she'd never seen him just hang around somewhere either. He wasn't drinking or smoking with her crew, just sitting at the table with her. Brooding. She really wished he'd do it somewhere else. She wasn't exactly a people person and had no idea how to deal with someone like this. At least without firearms. There were questions she wanted to ask though, but, to hell with it. You seem to have two eyes now. 12, he said absently. It was as though he'd answered on automatic. She blinked. Whatever answer she had expected, that hadn't been it. Mind if I use your back room for a day or two? The question was a bit random, but at least that was normal for Harry. Sure. Sure. Why? Need to do a ritual. Oh. Yeah, that was definitely a Harry answer. All right. She turned her head to face the bar. Everyone stay the fuck out of the basement until he says otherwise. She jabbed a thumb at Harry. Yes, boss. I don't think I'm ever going to get tired of hearing that. Harry didn't quite smile, but he nodded. It's nice, isn't it? He lapsed back into silence and stared off into space. She wanted to ask the biggest question on her mind, well, aside from what had happened to his eye, but she just knew that wasn't going to be a good question to ask. She didn't know why, but he was back far too early and didn't have any stories about his family's exploits either. Pansy stubbed out the remainder of her cigarette and motioned for someone to bring her a drink. It had taken all of a few minutes for her guys to learn not to argue with her when she wanted alcohol. She knocked back the tumbler of whiskey and sighed as the heat crawled down her throat. It gave her a nice, comforting warmth, and right now, she was starting to feel a little cold. Sasuke just barely kept his blade from slicing into the man when he materialized beside him. His arm certainly twitched enough for any veteran ninja to know what had almost happened. Can I help you? His eyes were still covered by bandages from his own impromptu surgery. It had been agonizing, but he wasn't exactly going to go back to Leaf with his brothers while so recently transferred, and Kabuto probably wouldn't be accepting his application for return to Sound either. Probably for the best that Kabuto had taught him medical techniques then. He didn't ask who the man was. The fact that he'd appeared from nowhere went a long way to telling him. He was fairly certain the man wasn't the fourth returned from the dead, which left only one person. I'm here to offer you revenge. Right, Sasuke thought. Pretend you don't know. Pretend you don't know. Pretend you don't know. Chapter 102, Income Never Mind. Cornelius Fudge had been getting increasingly worried for several years now. If asked in anything resembling an official capacity, he would have explained that his concern was because the Orus, nominally a peacekeeping body, were becoming more and more militarized. And violent. Mustn't forget that. Had anyone asked in a more private manner, it would have been because there had been a drop in his bribe money. While families still paid handsomely for certain privileges, there were fewer opportunities for it. Everyone was keeping to strictly legal loopholes, and that meant that it was more a matter of expedition fees than looking at other way fees, which were usually much larger. Amelia Bones had gotten out of control with investigations, and the Aurors were no longer accepting a consideration to leave things be. Actually, come to think of it, he was a bit worried about the Aurors after all. They were a body of increasingly well-trained personnel with a decidedly violent streak, and were apparently fanatic in their loyalty to their Hogwarts professor. That wasn't good. Not at all. And if he hadn't been worried about it beforehand, he certainly was by the time the syrup had finished dripping into his ear. The flames in Dumbledore's fireplace blazed green. That wasn't too odd, he had visitors and desperate pleas for help all the time. What was odd was that it was Lucius Malfoy. Dumbledore. The man seemed desperately grateful that he'd found the aged wizard. You've got to help me. Putting on his most genial expression of elderly imbecility, Dumbledore looked confused. Is something the matter, Lucius? Please? He's going to bring it down around our ears. Still apparently lost in the maze of history, Dumbledore couldn't help but be curious. Who is going to bring what down our ears, my boy? Fudge. Malfoy snapped, sounding truly furious. He's gone mad. The whole government is going to burn if we don't do something about it. Would you care to elaborate? He's decided to appoint a defense professor, Dumbledore. And not let Professor Potter teach. Dumbledore paled, his vacuous mask shattering. He's going to what? He waved his wand, allowing Malfoy to enter his office, and the man sank into a chair like a puppet with cut strings. Apparently, I haven't been paying him enough attention. Some absolute moron has gotten it into his head that Professor Potter is building an army to take over the ministry. Dumbledore winced. You know, I'm not entirely sure he's wrong. Do you think that will make a difference to Professor Potter? Another wince. No. All right. We can fix this. Just give him some money and he'll shut up like normal. Don't you think I've tried that? Malfoy pulled a flask from his pocket and took a long pull of whatever spirit he'd brought along. But the idea's fixed in his idiotic little head. If he's got good reason to be worried, that'd be why it's so hard to convince him that he's not in danger. I mean, I don't think Professor Potter has the slightest design on the office or the government. Dumbledore then added quietly, except maybe subverting it. What? Nothing. So, the problem is that somehow Fudge has finally noticed that there are 3 years of Auror trainees and inductees who are trained to be near murderous in their pursuit of justice. I never said he was quick on the uptake, Headmaster. Right. Well, he now has his law enforcement body, which is supposed to, among other things, protect him, rapidly filling with devotees of Professor Potter. To say nothing of the glut of hit wizards displacing veterans on 6 continents. You're not making this seem any less of a problem. I'm more musing that he's already too late. And Amelia Bones will want his head when she finds out about this too. How about I put the cherry on this steaming pile of horror? Malfoy's expression was one of sick joy. He's selected as the new instructor, the undersecretary. Merlin's pendulous scrotum. Dumbledore ejaculated. The government will burn around our ears. Exactly. While I fully grasp the problem, Dumbledore continued, sounding calmer. I am not sure what you want to do about it, short of going in with wands blazing. And I suspect the new crop of Aurors will be lethally displeased with such an action. Which is why I came to you, Malfoy explained. We have enough votes to get him out today if we work. He seemed to be having some trouble finishing his sentence. Work together? Dumbledore had learned over the years to take his petty enjoyment where he could. Seeing Malfoy's flinch at the words was just the sort of joy that one had to savor in a world of politics. And since he was about to embark on another such foray, it was only appropriate he have a memory to warm his heart. Yes. Malfoy's gritted teeth were like a balm for the soul of an old man. I can have the vote scheduled for 2 hours for now. Less if we don't mind cutting a few technical corners. Nothing actually illegal, but perhaps not the done thing. Professor Potter's classes do tend to leave out the more political aspects. Perhaps I should see about having someone address that deficiency. Are you sure you want that? Dumbledore paused and considered it. Maybe not. All right then. Who do we put into power? Well, I'd normally prefer someone easily bribed, but that's been less and less useful for a few years now. I'd settle for someone who'll at least not empty my coffers. We could always go with Madame Bones. You haven't been visited by her new crop of Aurors. They are not friendly. I don't think I can describe for you how much it would be unwise to have her in charge of the government with her current mindset. The innocent have nothing to fear. I haven't done anything criminal. Malfoy paused. Recently. And I get harassed at least once a month. It's rather annoying. I don't know that you qualify as innocent though. Regardless, there's no way my votes would go for her. Well, I think I'll stick with Remus Lupin then. A werewolf. Malfoy was clearly nonplussed. How on earth do you think that will sell? Well, he's not going to be big on violence or anything. He's big on peace and letting others live. And creatures' rights, Malfoy muttered. So, he'll rock a few boats. Maybe shake up the ministry so there are more competent employees and fewer legacy appointments? It's that, or I just lock down the wards and wait for the rubble to stop bouncing, Lucius. He'd always considered himself a good judge of character, with one glaring exception that haunted him, and Malfoy was nearly certain that Albus Dumbledore was bluffing. The man was a do-gooder by nature. But there was always the chance. And Malfoy Manor was sturdy, but not as sturdy as Hogwarts, and for all that Dumbledore held a post in the magical government and had another half-dozen important titles and positions, he was not as integrally tied to the system as the Malfoy family. Their wealth was in investments more than it was in liquid assets, and that meant that if the whole thing collapsed, the family would lose heavily at best. For that matter, he'd made his niche in the world, and if he'd had to adjust to be less criminal and more a broker of favors and sometimes things which he was legally considered ignorant of, well, that was just the world changing, and any decent manipulator didn't try to alter the path of the flood. And so, despite a dislike of werewolves that bordered on pathological, which was only sensible after spending years in the company of monsters like Fenrir Greyback, and another decade working with the especially unsavory elements of Nocturne, Malfoy nodded. I'll go marshal the troops, get the no-confidence vote rolling, sell my people, and draft his acceptance speech. When Dumbledore opened his mouth, Malfoy interrupted. Do you want to write it? Because I know that he won't know how to even start. The mouth closed. Right. All you have to do is rally your people and convince the werewolf that he should take up the post of minister. Dumbledore scowled. He wasn't entirely sure that he hadn't been stuck with the harder tasks. It was to the surprise of both of them that Malfoy and Dumbledore met in the Chief Warlock's office after the vote for a glass of something absurdly expensive that was like pouring velvet down their throats. But they both could enjoy how things had gone earlier. The look on Fudge's face when he realized what the session was for had almost been worth the years of his idiocy and general blithering. The two of them toasted to the expression when the vote had come in and the buffoon had been tossed on his ear from the minister's chair by a near-unanimous wave of lit wands. And even Malfoy had to admit to having a perverse pleasure watching his fellow dark wizards back a known werewolf to be the new minister. If he also enjoyed the look of defeat from Amelia Bones at the same time, well, that wasn't exactly a secret. That wasn't to say that things had been smooth. The two of them were also drinking to not think about the chaos that was almost certainly coming down the way. They had a minister with no political background and a solid mandate which had not been clearly directed at anything other than not being Cornelius Fudge. Who knows what madness they had unleashed? But they could be fairly certain it wouldn't be quite as bad as if Professor Potter had found out that he was banned from teaching. That would have been a nightmare. Malfoy did take an extra sip to remember the speech he'd written for the werewolf. He hadn't agreed with more than one word in 10, but it had been beautifully written nevertheless. A perfect storm of talk about the need for preserving valued traditions and expanding horizons to allow for growth with the best and brightest. He'd touched on the importance of the wider magical community and the contributions they could offer us. What a load of tripe. He'd made sure to draft up a schedule of meetings for the minister's first week too. He didn't think he could prevent the drastic changes he saw coming to their world, but he hoped he could make sure he knew who was in on the ground floor. And, for that matter, that they weren't too out there. He'd rather a goblin who was merely untrustworthy to one who was actively traitorous. Or planning the next war. To say nothing of picking out a hag who stuck to natural cadavers instead of creating them herself. If he could have, he'd have had Madame Bones replaced, but there was no way that such a widely popular director was going to be removed by a new minister, no matter how solid the vote had been. Not unless there had been some scandal, which Malfoy had avoided manufacturing out of fear for his life. All in all, a successful day, Dumbledore stated. Not the easiest, and that speech was a truly beautiful load of dragon dung. It was, wasn't it? Malfoy smiled beatifically. I just asked myself, what would Dumbledore say? Thank you. The reply was drier. The headmaster knocked back the remainder of his drink and began to pour himself another. I decided to make sure this mess never happens again. I don't care how much he complains, he's going to be a full staff member starting this year. Privately, Dumbledore was only mildly concerned about the alleged curse. While something like 30 or 40 years of bad luck with defense instructors might seem like a pattern, he always chose to see it as a truly disastrous series of unfortunate events. And while Professor Potter was the prophecy child and therefore important to keep alive in order to kill Voldemort whenever the monster finally returned from the half-dead state he'd been in when he escaped Quirrell 2 years prior, well, so far there didn't seem to be a chance anything existed which could kill Professor Potter. I wish I could say I'm surprised, Malfoy replied. He wasn't thrilled, but it wasn't a shock. Though Lupin, Minister Lupin is a good man who was thoroughly traumatized by his time teaching Professor Potter's students after they'd had only a few months of the young man. I'm fairly certain if I left the matter open, we'd be calling for another no-confidence vote come morning. Malfoy scowled, his buzz vanishing. You utter bastard. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.